Picture the sun beating down on a vast, open plain, the air thick with dust and anticipation. In the distance, the glint of bronze spear points catches the light as thousands of warriors stand ready, their fate resting entirely on the mind of one person. This was the reality for ancient commanders who faced decisions that would echo through millennia, where a single strategic choice could mean the difference between empire and oblivion, between cultural legacy and complete annihilation. These weren't just battlefield tacticians, they were psychologists, logisticians, and visionary leaders operating under pressures we can scarcely comprehend today. Their innovations in warfare didn't just determine who won or lost a battle, they fundamentally shaped the course of human civilization, laying the groundwork for everything from modern military doctrine to corporate leadership strategies. What separated these legendary figures from ordinary leaders wasn't merely courage or strength, but something far more profound, a unique way of thinking that transformed chaos into order and uncertainty into victory. To truly understand these ancient generals, we need to step beyond the dates and locations of famous battles and venture into the mental landscapes where these conflicts were truly won or lost. Imagine the weight of commanding armies without satellite imagery, without instant communication, without any of the technological advantages modern leaders take for granted. These commanders relied on intuition honed by experience, on psychological insight into both their troops and their enemies, and on an almost supernatural ability to read terrain, weather, and human nature itself. They were playing a game of multidimensional chess where every move could cost thousands of lives and determine the cultural trajectory of entire regions. Their strategic brilliance emerged from this incredible pressure, creating solutions and approaches to conflict that remain studied and admired thousands of years later. This journey into the minds of history's first great military leaders will reveal how their thought processes developed, how they managed the immense psychological burdens of command, and how their innovations continue to influence everything from modern business strategy to international relations. We'll explore the mental frameworks that allowed them to turn certain defeat into stunning victory, the leadership principles that maintained discipline in armies of diverse cultures and languages, and the tactical genius that enabled them to overcome seemingly impossible odds. These weren't just warriors, they were some of history's greatest problem solvers, and their approaches to challenge and conflict contain timeless lessons about human nature, decision-making, and the art of turning vision into reality. To grasp the sheer magnitude of their achievements, we must rewind the clock to a pivotal turning point in human history, a period when the very nature of conflict was reinvented. Before the rise of great generals, warfare was often a matter of raids and skirmishes, a chaotic and personal affair between neighboring villages or tribes. But around 3000 BC, something extraordinary began to take shape in the fertile crescents of Mesopotamia and along the Nile. The emergence of the first true cities and states brought with it a new scale of ambition, wealth, and territory to protect. This new world demanded a new kind of war. It was no longer enough to gather a band of local fighters. Leaders now needed to project power across vast distances, control populations numbering in the tens of thousands, and manage resources for sustained campaigns. This was the crucible in which organized warfare was forged. The catalyst for this revolution was the creation of the professional soldier. For the first time, individuals were dedicated entirely to the art of war, trained not just in the use of a spear or a bow, but in moving and fighting as a single, cohesive unit. This shift from a militia of farmers to a standing army was as transformative as the invention of the wheel. Standardization followed. No longer were warriors armed with a haphazard collection of personally owned weapons. Armies began to produce equipment in bulk, identical spears, uniform shields, and standardized armor, allowing for interchangeable parts and simplified repairs on campaign. This logistical foresight meant a broken shield could be replaced instantly from the supply train, turning a potential crisis into a minor inconvenience. This focus on systems and uniformity reveals a mentality that was already thinking several moves ahead, a hallmark of the strategic mind. No single figure embodies this dawn of military strategy more than Sargan of Akkad. Tradition holds that he started as a cupbearer to a king, a position that granted him intimate knowledge of court politics and power structures, but his true genius lay in his vision for empire. He didn't just conquer a city and demand tribute, he sought to permanently absorb territories into a unified whole. To do this, he had to solve problems of a scale never before attempted. How do you feed an army on a march of hundreds of miles? How do you maintain the morale and discipline of your troops when they are far from home for months or even years? Sargan's answer was the invention of sustained campaign strategy. He established reliable supply lines, secured sources of food and water in advance, and likely used a core of loyal, professional troops to integrate conquered soldiers into his forces, constantly renewing his army's strength. He wasn't just fighting battles, he was building an empire through meticulous, forward-thinking organization. We are not relying solely on legend to understand this military revolution. The physical evidence speaks volumes. The royal cemetery of with its elaborate death pits, contains not only the remains of rulers but of soldiers arranged in neat rows, buried with their standardized helmets and weapons, suggesting a formal military hierarchy and unit structure even in 4500 BC. Even more telling are the countless cuneiform tablets from across Mesopotamia. These aren't just epic poems glorifying kings, they are administrative records. They meticulously account for the issue of rations to soldiers, the distribution of bronze to armories for spearhead production, and the assignment of corvée labor to maintain defensive walls. One tablet might be the ancient equivalent of a payroll sheet, while another details the precise number of baked loaves required to feed a regiment for a week. This bureaucratic machinery was the unsung hero of ancient warfare, the backbone that allowed a general's brilliant tactical idea to be executed on the battlefield. This monumental shift from chaotic fighting to calculated warfare represents one of humanity's most profound evolutionary steps. It marked the moment when raw force began to be tempered by planning, when violence was channeled through organization. The patterns established in those ancient river valleys, the professional army, the supply chain, the tactical formation, the grand strategy created a blueprint. This blueprint would be studied, refined, and executed by every great general who followed, from the deserts of Egypt to the hills of Greece. They stood on the shoulders of these first military innovators, who looked at the chaos of combat and saw, for the very first time, the possibility of order. Consider the immense psychological isolation of commanding an ancient army. There were no staff meetings with intelligence briefings, no real-time maps updating enemy positions, no secure radio channels to coordinate distant units. A general's world was one of profound sensory limitation, where critical decisions rested on fragments of information brought by breathless scouts, rumors from deserters, and the intuitive reading of distant dust clouds. This informational vacuum was filled by two powerful forces: a deep, almost obsessive attention to logistical detail and a profound belief in divine favor. A commander's mind had to become a living ledger, constantly calculating grain consumption for 10,000 men and their animals, the rate of arrow expenditure, the wear on sandals, and the mood of the troops. Simultaneously, he had to project an aura of unshakable certainty, often attributing his strategic insights to the will of the gods, because to show doubt was to risk the entire army's fragile cohesion. This constant juggling of the mundane and the metaphysical created a unique and intense form of leadership stress. This pressure cooker environment forged leaders who were masters of what we might now call asymmetric information warfare. Lacking satellites, they became expert readers of the natural world. The direction of migrating birds could hint at the location of water sources beyond the horizon. The behavior of livestock in a captured village might reveal if a larger enemy force was recently stationed nearby. A sudden silence from the local insect population could be the only warning of an ambush ahead. Their intuition was a trained database of environmental clues and human patterns, a mental model built from countless campaigns, a decision to march or to camp, to attack at dawn or to feign a retreat, was never just a tactical choice. It was a high-stakes gamble based on interpreting a chaotic and often misleading set of signals. The mental toll of this, knowing a single misread omen or overlooked detail could lead to catastrophe, required a form of cognitive resilience that is difficult to comprehend. We see this starkly in the recorded actions of Pharaoh Thutmos III of Egypt. His famed victory at Megiddo, a masterpiece of unexpected maneuver through a narrow pass, was a decision his own war council vehemently opposed, calling the route too dangerous and risking ambush. Thutmos had to override his entire command structure, staking his authority and the survival of his army on a gut feeling. Later accounts describe his physical reactions to stress, sleeplessness, loss of appetite, a relentless focus on minutiae symptoms modern psychology would easily recognize. His coping mechanism wasn't therapy, it was ritual and meticulous planning. He would have immersed himself in the ceremonies of Ammon, reinforcing his divine mandate, while also personally overseeing the inventory of chariot axles and the rationing of water skins. This combination of spiritual affirmation and hyper-attention to logistics was the psychological armor that allowed him to bear the weight of command. This mindset was a volatile mixture of paranoia and creativity. A successful general had to be paranoid enough to anticipate betrayal from his own lieutenants, to suspect every peaceful offer from an enemy as a potential trick, and to constantly question his own supply lines. Yet he also had to be creatively open to absurd, unconventional solutions. Hannibal didn't cross the Alps with elephants because it was the obvious choice. He did it because it was the last thing the Romans would ever expect. This creative paranoia was a survival mechanism. It meant constantly running mental simulations of disaster. What if the river floods? What if the Allies desert? What if the harvest fails? And having a contingency plan for each scenario. Their strategic brilliance often sprang from this prepared mind, this ability to turn a potential catastrophe into a tactical opportunity because they had already imagined it happening. Ultimately, the ancient commander's psychology was built on a foundation of performative conviction. He had to project absolute confidence even when internally racked by doubt. Every speech to the troops, every sacrifice to the gods, every inspection of the lines was a performance designed to manufacture certainty out of thin air. He was managing the collective psyche of thousands of individuals, transforming their individual fears into a unified will. This wasn't about being the strongest or bravest fighter. It was about being the most convincing actor on the world's most dangerous stage, a leader who could make his army believe in victory so utterly that they would willingly march into what looked like certain death, trusting that his unique mind had seen a path to triumph where they could only see risk. This profound understanding of the environment as a weapon represents perhaps the most fundamental strategic principle to emerge from the ancient world. For these early commanders, a mountain wasn't just an obstacle to march around, it was a potential ally. A river wasn't merely a source of water, it was a movable defensive line or a devastating tool of surprise. Their cognitive leap was to stop seeing the natural world as a passive stage for their battles and start viewing it as an active, manipulable force multiplier. This required a completely different mode of thinking, one that combined the observational skills of a geologist, the predictive ability of a meteorologist, and the cunning of a hunter. They learned to read the land not for its beauty, but for its lethal potential. The legendary Greek victory at Marathon offers a perfect case study in this tactical geography. The Persian army, vast and confident, landed on the shores of Attica, expecting to use its overwhelming numbers to simply roll over the outnumbered Athenian hoplites. The Greek general Miltiades, however, saw the battlefield not as a flat, open space where numbers would decide the day, but as a carefully constrained killing zone. The plain of Marathon is flanked by marshes and the sea, creating a natural funnel. Miltiades deliberately weakened his center and strengthened his flanks, then advanced at a run to minimize the time his men were exposed to Persian arrows. As he anticipated, the strong Persian center pushed the weaker Greek center back, but this was the trap. The retreat drew the Persians deeper into the narrowing plain, while the powerful Greek flanks held firm and then turned inward, compressing the invading army from three sides. The Persians, unable to use their numerical advantage or their cavalry effectively in the confined space, were utterly routed. Miltiades didn't win by being stronger. He won by being a better architect of space, using the terrain itself to redesign the battle to his specifications. This philosophy was being codified on the other side of the world with even greater systematic rigor. In China, the military philosopher Sun Tzu dedicated a significant portion of his seminal work, The Art of War, to categorizing and explaining the strategic use of terrain. He didn't just list landscape features, he analyzed their psychological and logistical impact on an army. He described entrapping ground, where you must fight desperately because there is no retreat, and open ground where mobility is key. He wrote about heavy ground, rich in resources that an army can seize, and light ground, where penetration is shallow and a quick retreat is possible. For Sun Tzu, every type of ground demanded a different mental approach and a different set of actions from the commander. A smart general didn't just react to the terrain. He proactively sought out the ground that would give him the maximum advantage and force his enemy into the maximum disadvantage. This was warfare elevated from brute force to a form of high-level chess played on a living, breathing board. The application of this principle went far beyond choosing a good hill to defend. These masters of environmental warfare actively weaponized the elements. There are accounts of armies deliberately diverting rivers to flood an enemy's camp or cut off their supply routes overnight. Others would set controlled fires upwind to fill an enemy position with smoke and ash, blinding and choking them before the first arrow was ever fired. A general marching through a dry region might feign a water shortage to lure his opponent into a desperate pursuit, only to lead them deeper into a true waterless trap. Perhaps the most psychologically devastating use of terrain was the calculated ceding of territory. A clever commander might allow an enemy to occupy a tempting piece of high ground, only for that enemy to discover too late that the position was isolated, exposed to the elements, and impossible to supply. The victory was achieved not through combat, but through thermodynamics and hunger, as the sun and starvation did the general's work for him. This was strategy at its most elegant and most ruthless, defeating an enemy by convincing the environment to turn against them. This ancient art of terrain mastery is far from a historical relic. Its core principles are alive and well in modern contexts, from corporate strategy to emergency management. A business leader choosing where to position a new store uses the same principles of evaluating access, visibility, and the lay of the land of the market. Environmental scientists planning containment for a disaster must think like ancient generals, using natural contours to channel or block the flow of everything from floodwaters to wildfires. The cognitive framework remains identical. Stop fighting against your environment and start collaborating with it. See the world not as a list of obstacles, but as a toolkit of opportunities. This shift in perspective, first perfected by commanders thousands of years ago under the pressure of survival, remains one of the most powerful ways to approach any complex challenge, transforming apparent limitations into our greatest advantages. While terrain provided the physical stage for these ancient conflicts, the most brilliant commanders understood that the real battlefield existed first and foremost in the minds of their enemies. They pioneered a form of warfare that was less about clashing steel and more about shattering expectations, manipulating perception, and winning victories long before the first soldier ever drew a weapon. This was the birth of psychological operations, a sophisticated art of deception that turned information itself into a weapon more potent than any sword. These generals realized that an army confused, demoralized, or terrified was already half defeated, and they dedicated immense creative energy to engineering that state of mind in their opponents. The story of Hannibal Barca and his war elephants crossing the Alps is often told as a staggering logistical achievement, which it certainly was. But to view it only through that lens misses its deeper, more terrifying purpose. For the Romans awaiting him in Italy, the elephant was not merely an animal. It was a creature of myth and nightmare, a living siege tower that was impervious to their spears and could not be outflanked. Hannibal knew this. His decision to bring 37 of these beasts on an impossible march through frozen mountain passes was a calculated act of psychological theater. The logistical nightmare was a feature, not a bug. It made his eventual appearance in Italy so utterly unexpected, so seemingly superhuman, that the legend of his invincibility preceded him. The real weapon wasn't the elephant's tusks, it was the paralyzing shock and awe it inflicted on the Roman legions, a fear that Hannibal would ruthlessly exploit in the battles to come. This philosophy of winning through deception was being systematically codified half a world away. In ancient China, military philosophers like Sun Tzu elevated trickery to a central principle of statecraft and strategy. Their concept of Bing Fa, the art of war, was built on a foundation of manipulating reality to achieve victory with minimal bloodshed. Their treatises are filled with deviously creative tactics designed to attack an enemy's decision-making process. They would craft entire armies out of straw and wood, dummy soldiers left in plain view to convince a distant observer they were vastly outnumbered. They stage-managed false retreats, not as a sign of weakness, but as a carefully baited hook to lure an overconfident enemy into a carefully prepared ambush. They even spread debilitating rumors through merchant networks and turned their own spies into double agents, feeding commanders a diet of lies so convincing that even the truth would later be dismissed. The ultimate goal of Bing Fa was the ultimate efficiency, to break an enemy's will, collapse their alliances, and seize their cities without ever having to fight a costly pitched battle. Perhaps no single story captures the essence of ancient psychological warfare better than the legend of the Trojan horse, a tale that has endured for millennia precisely because it encapsulates a timeless truth. Whether historical fact or powerful allegory, the story illustrates a profound strategic insight. The strongest gates cannot keep out an idea. The Greeks, after 10 years of failed siege warfare, switched from a strategy of force to a strategy of cunning. They understood that the Trojans, for all their defensive preparations, possessed a cultural pride and a religious piety that could be turned against them. The horse was a masterstroke of tailored psychological manipulation. It was not just a trick, it was a message crafted specifically for its audience, an offering that appealed to Trojan vanity and their desire to claim a tangible symbol of their victory. By making the Trojans complicit in their own downfall, by having them physically drag the instrument of their destruction inside their own impregnable walls, the Greeks achieved a perfectly efficient victory. The story endures because it teaches that the most formidable defenses are often psychological, and the most effective attacks target those very vulnerabilities. The sophistication of these operations reveals an astonishingly advanced understanding of human psychology, developed centuries before the formal discipline existed. These generals were practical behavioral scientists. They intuitively grasped concepts like confirmation bias, understanding that an enemy would believe a lie if it confirmed what they already feared or desired. They leveraged groupthink, knowing that panic or overconfidence could spread through an army like a contagion, overwhelming the rational judgment of individual soldiers. They weaponized cultural narratives and religious omens, staging elaborate rituals or manufacturing divine signs to boost the morale of their own troops while sowing doubt and despair in the enemy ranks. Their campaigns of deception were built on a deep study of their opponent's culture, leadership, and morale. They knew that to defeat an army, you first had to deceive its commander, and to deceive its commander, you had to understand the very workings of his mind. While psychological warfare targeted the enemy's mind, the most formidable challenge for any ancient commander often lay in a far more mundane but absolutely critical domain: the relentless, unglamorous, and life-or-death struggle to keep an army fed, equipped, and moving. The true measure of a general's genius was frequently found not in a brilliant cavalry charge, but in a meticulously calculated grain ledger. An army, after all, is a massive, ravenous organism that consumes resources at a staggering pace. A force of 40,000 men and 10,000 animals could require over 100 tons of food and fodder every single day, not to mention the constant need for water, replacement weapons, medicine, and spare parts for everything from chariot wheels to sandals. A commander who failed to solve this equation didn't just risk defeat. He guaranteed the complete disintegration of his force through starvation, disease, and desertion. The battlefield was merely the final exam. The real test was passed months in advance in the careful planning of supply routes and the mathematical precision of consumption rates. No figure in antiquity better exemplifies this mastery of military logistics than Alexander the Great. His decade-long campaign into the heart of the Persian Empire remains one of history's most astonishing logistical feats, a masterpiece of foresight and adaptive planning. Alexander understood that his Macedonian army couldn't simply live off the land in the vast, often sparse territories they traversed. His solution was a multi-layered, flexible supply system that would impress a modern corporate logistics officer. Supply ships shadowed his army's march along the Mediterranean and Persian Gulf coastlines, serving as floating warehouses that could be called upon when needed. In newly conquered territories, he immediately established fortified supply depots, strategically positioned to serve as waypoints for reinforcements and reservoirs of grain for the main army's return journey or future operations. Most ingeniously, he didn't see foraging as a chaotic free-for-all, but organized it into a disciplined system. Specialized units would fan out ahead of the main column, not to pillage, but to systematically purchase or requisition supplies from local populations according to a pre-arranged plan, minimizing hostility and ensuring a steady, predictable flow of provisions. This intricate network allowed Alexander to project power over thousands of miles, maintaining the fighting strength and morale of his army in environments that should have consumed them. The Romans institutionalized this logistical brilliance, turning it into the permanent backbone of their military machine and a key reason for the empire's enduring power. Their innovations were breathtaking in their scope and complexity. They pioneered standardized rationing, with every soldier entitled to a precise amount of grain, salt, vinegar, and bacon, a system that simplified procurement and ensured equitable distribution across legions stationed from Britain to Egypt. They fielded mobile engineering units that could construct a fortified camp complete with defensive walls, streets, and sanitation facilities in a matter of hours at the end of every day's march, providing security and hygiene that preserved combat effectiveness. But their crowning achievement was the Roman road network. These were not mere paths, they were sophisticated highways built for rapid military deployment, allowing legions to march at speeds unmatched until the 19th century. These roads connected a vast web of granaries, arms factories, and ports, creating a true just-in-time logistics system that could rush reinforcements and supplies to any threatened frontier. For the Romans, a well-supplied army was an obedient and effective army, and their logistical infrastructure was a strategic weapon that often made actual fighting unnecessary, demonstrating power through presence and sustainability alone. The cognitive demands of this supply chain warfare were immense, requiring a form of thinking that blended advanced mathematics with deep ecological knowledge. A quartermaster had to calculate consumption rates down to the ounce per man per day, forecast needs months in advance based on marching distances and expected campaign duration, and constantly adjust for variables like spoilage, loss, and unexpected delays. This required an intimate understanding of agricultural cycles. An army arriving in a region a month before the harvest would find barren fields, while an arrival a month after could feast on freshly threshed grain. Operating in unfamiliar territories added another layer of difficulty. Commanders had to quickly learn which local plants were edible, where reliable water sources were located, and how to navigate landscapes without accurate maps. They were managing a massive, mobile corporation under constant threat of attack, where a single broken axle on a grain wagon or a contaminated water source could cascade into a campaign-ending disaster. This relentless focus on detail separated the legendary commanders from the merely competent ones. While a good tactical mind could win a battle, only a master logistician could win a war. This ancient focus on the unglamorous backbone of warfare holds a powerful lesson that transcends military history. In any complex endeavor, whether launching a product, managing a crisis, or executing a long-term project, the most visible successes are almost always built upon a foundation of invisible, meticulous preparation. The brilliant marketing campaign fails if the supply chain cannot deliver the product. The innovative software update crashes without a robust and tested back-end infrastructure. The ancient generals teach us that true strategy involves mastering the boring, difficult, and essential details that make the dramatic victories possible. They understood that vision without logistics is merely hallucination, and that the most profound power often lies not in the spectacular blow, but in the unwavering ability to sustain effort, outlast opponents, and ensure that your own system remains functioning long after others have collapsed under their own weight. Yet for all their brilliance in logistics and psychology, the greatest ancient commanders possessed one overarching quality that separated the legendary from the merely competent, a mind that could evolve in real time. This was not merely about planning or deception, but about a profound cognitive flexibility, the ability to watch a carefully constructed strategy unravel under the chaos of combat and instantly innovate a new path to victory. Where a lesser leader might see only disaster, these masters of warfare perceived opportunity, constantly rewriting the rules of engagement based on the fluid, unpredictable feedback of the battlefield itself. Their genius lay in adaptive tactics, a form of evolutionary combat where the best idea won not because it was preordained, but because it proved itself in the crucible of conflict. We see this principle executed with breathtaking audacity on the plains of Leuctra in 371 BCE. The Theban general Epermanondas faced a seemingly insurmountable challenge: the Spartan army, the most feared and undefeated military force in Greece, renowned for its discipline and the crushing power of its right wing. Conventional wisdom demanded a symmetrical response to meet strength with equal strength in a head-on collision of identical formations. Epermanondas instead chose cognitive asymmetry. He deliberately weakened his own right wing and arranged his best troops on the left in a deep, dense column 50 men deep, an unprecedented formation that functioned like a military spearhead. But his most revolutionary decision was to refuse his right flank. He ordered that side of his line to advance slowly or even hold back, a move that defied all Greek military doctrine. This was not a random gamble, it was a calculated deconstruction of the enemy's predictable pattern. The Spartans, conditioned to seek out and destroy the opposition's strongest unit, found themselves drawn toward the massive Theban left. As the two powerful wings engaged, the refused Theban right was not caught in the fray, allowing Epermanondas to concentrate his force like a hammer blow on a single, critical point of the Spartan line, shattering their command structure and ending their myth of invincibility in a single afternoon. He won by abandoning the rulebook entirely and designing a new one in the moment. This adaptive approach to warfare required a specific and demanding form of intelligence. Modern neuroscience suggests that this kind of rapid, innovative problem-solving under extreme stress is linked to heightened activity in the prefrontal cortex, the brain's center for executive function and complex decision-making. An ancient general had to be a master of pattern recognition, scanning the chaos of the battlefield for fleeting weaknesses and emerging opportunities. He then had to engage in counterfactual thinking, mentally simulating multiple potential outcomes for each possible action in a matter of seconds. If I charge the left flank, how will their cavalry respond? If I feign a retreat, will their commander grow overconfident? This was followed by a willingness to override deeply ingrained training and social convention, a cognitive flexibility that allowed him to discard a failing plan without hesitation. Finally, he had to project this new solution with absolute confidence to his subordinate officers and troops, transforming a novel, untested idea into immediate, decisive action. This mental process, repeated across countless engagements, is what turned a competent officer into a history-altering strategist. The evidence for this relentless tactical evolution is etched not just in historical accounts, but in the very artifacts these armies left behind. The archaeological record reveals a continuous arms race driven by applied creativity rather than accidental discovery. The design of the Greek hoplite spear and the large round shield, the aspes, was perfected for the rigid phalanx formation. But when opponents developed tactics to break the phalanx, we see the subsequent emergence of lighter, more flexible armor and a new class of soldier, the peltaste, a skirmisher armed with javelins designed to harass and disrupt from a distance. This prompted further innovation in response, like the development of more mobile cavalry to chase down these lighter troops. In Persia, under visionary leaders like Cyrus the Great, we see the birth of truly integrated combined arms tactics. Cyrus and his commanders didn't just field chariots, cavalry, and infantry as separate units. They learned to choreograph them like instruments in an orchestra. Chariots might charge to disrupt enemy formations, creating chaos that disciplined infantry squares could then exploit, while cavalry swooped in to attack vulnerable flanks and pursue a broken foe. Each component covered the weaknesses of the others, creating a tactical system far more adaptable and resilient than any single focused force. This ancient dance of action and reaction offers a powerful blueprint for navigating any complex competitive environment today. The principle of adaptive tactics teaches us that rigid adherence to a single plan, no matter how brilliant, is often a recipe for failure in a dynamic world. The most successful leaders in business, technology, or any field are those who treat their strategies as living hypotheses, not immutable doctrines. They constantly gather real-world feedback, possess the humility to recognize when their initial approach is not working, and have the courage to pivot quickly, reallocating resources and energy toward what is actually proving effective. They understand that innovation is rarely a single, monumental breakthrough, but more often a continuous process of small, rapid adaptations, a relentless evolutionary pressure applied to one's own methods. Just as the ancient general observed the enemy's adjustments and evolved his tactics accordingly, we too must learn to see unexpected challenges not as setbacks, but as the most valuable data points for designing our next, more effective move. Beyond the clash of armies and the mastery of terrain, the most visionary ancient generals understood that the deepest currents of victory flowed through the customs, beliefs, and social fabric of their enemies. They pioneered a form of warfare that was fundamentally ethnographic, recognizing that to conquer a people, you first had to comprehend their culture. This was not a passive academic exercise, it was an aggressive, strategic intelligence operation. These commanders were proto-anthropologists on the battlefield, meticulously studying the societal pressures, religious taboos, and political fractures of their adversaries, then weaponizing that knowledge to shatter alliances, demoralize populations, and win wars from the inside out. Their greatest weapon was often not a new piece of military technology, but a well-translated scroll or a conversation with a defector that revealed the invisible seams along which an entire empire could be split apart. The campaign of Alexander the Great against the Persian Empire stands as the ultimate testament to the power of this cultural intelligence. Alexander did not see Persia as a monolithic enemy to be crushed with brute force. Through his tutor Aristotle and his own keen study, he understood it as a vast, complex tapestry of satrapies, each with its own ambitions and often tenuous loyalty to the central throne. His strategy was one of precision targeting. He knew which Persian governors were discontent and could be flipped to his side with promises of power, and which regions chafed under Persian rule and would welcome him as a liberator. After his decisive victory at Issus, he made a point of capturing Darius's family not to humiliate them, but to treat them with impeccable royal dignity. This was a masterstroke of psychological and cultural warfare. By honoring the Persian royal women, he signaled to the Persian nobility that he was not a barbarian invader intent on destruction, but a potential legitimate successor who respected their customs and could uphold their social order. He was fighting a war of perception as much as conquest, using his deep cultural knowledge to dismantle the will to resist him. The Romans institutionalized this ethnographic approach to strategy, turning it into a core function of their military and political machine. The writings of Julius Caesar on the Gallic Wars are less a simple chronicle of battles and more a detailed intelligence report on the tribes of Gaul. He meticulously documented their social structures, their seasonal migration patterns, their inter-tribal rivalries, and their religious ceremonies. This wasn't done out of idle curiosity. This knowledge was his playbook. He knew that the Nervii were renowned for their ferocity in frontal assault but had weaker cavalry, so he adjusted his fortifications and troop deployments accordingly. He understood that the Druids held immense social and political power that crossed tribal lines, which is why he made a concerted effort to target and marginalize their influence. The Roman intelligence apparatus extended far beyond the battlefield. They maintained networks of spies, merchants, and diplomats who fed a constant stream of information back to Rome about potential enemies, their economy, their leadership conflicts, their harvest yield. A Roman general often went to war with a detailed dossier not just on the enemy commander, but on the very society he was about to engage. This level of cultural mapping demanded a form of cognitive empathy that is staggering to consider. A successful commander had to temporarily set aside his own cultural framework and see the world through the eyes of his opponent. What did they value more than life itself? What would they consider a dishonor so profound it would force them into a rash action? What omens would fill them with dread or with courage? This required mastering languages, interpreting foreign social cues, and understanding religious motivations that were often completely alien. A Greek general needed to grasp the complex oracle systems that guided Egyptian pharaohs. A Mesopotamian king had to comprehend the nomadic tribal loyalties of desert peoples. This ability to mentally inhabit another culture was a sophisticated cognitive tool, allowing a commander to predict enemy movements not by reading terrain alone, but by reading their values. He could lay a trap that appealed to their sense of honor or stage a provocation that exploited a known religious anxiety. The battle was often won by whoever better understood the enemy's mind, and the enemy's mind was a product of their culture. This ancient principle of ethnographic strategy has never lost its relevance. It has only evolved with technology. In the modern era, understanding local tribal structures, religious sectarian divides, and historical grievances is just as critical for military and diplomatic success as it was in the ancient world. The failure to grasp these deep cultural currents has often led to catastrophic miscalculations, while those who invest in this deep intelligence find paths to resolution that are invisible on a simple map. Beyond the battlefield, this same principle applies to global business, international diplomacy, and humanitarian work. A corporation entering a new market must understand local consumer behavior, legal traditions, and social norms to succeed. The ancient generals teach us that whether you are leading an army or a multinational organization, true power lies not in imposing your own will, but in understanding the complex human landscape you wish to navigate. It is the ultimate strategic skill, transforming foreignness from a threat into an opportunity and revealing that the most formidable walls are never made of stone, but of custom and belief. While cultural intelligence provided a deep strategic advantage, the most forward-thinking commanders of the ancient world understood that another form of power could be forged in the workshop and the smithy. They recognized that wars were not only won in the minds of men or through logistical planning, but could be decided by a fundamental redesign of the very tools of combat. This was the dawn of research and development in warfare, a conscious drive to achieve technological supremacy that could shatter enemy formations, negate their strengths, and rewrite the rules of engagement. For these visionary leaders, a new weapon was not just a better piece of equipment. It was a strategic statement, a physical manifestation of a new way to think about conflict itself. The evolution of the Greek hoplite provides a perfect case study in this weapons-based strategy. The iconic panoply of the heavy infantryman, The large round aspis shield, the long thrusting spear, the bronze cuirass and helmet was not a random collection of gear. It was a meticulously integrated weapons system, each component designed to work in concert with the others to enable a specific and revolutionary tactical formation, the phalanx. The spear's length allowed multiple ranks to project their sharp points beyond the front line. The heavy shield, with its unique double grip system, was not just for personal protection. Its broad concave shape allowed a soldier to rest its weight on his shoulder, while its right-hand edge provided cover for the man to his left, creating an interlocking wall of bronze and wood. This was biomechanics applied to mass combat. A commander advocating for this technology was not simply buying better armor. He was investing in a physical platform that would allow his citizen soldiers to operate as a single, unstoppable machine, maximizing their collective strength while minimizing the individual skill required from each man. It turned a crowd of farmers into an engineered force. The Romans took this philosophy of integrated technological thinking to its logical and devastating conclusion. Their entire military machine was built around constant, incremental improvement, but their most famous innovation, the gladius sword, illustrates a profound understanding of tactical psychology and metallurgy. Earlier Mediterranean armies favored slashing swords, requiring wide, arcing swings that needed space and left the wielder exposed. The Roman gladius was different. It was a short, stout, double-edged weapon of high-quality Spanish steel, designed exclusively for brutal, efficient thrusting in tight quarters. This was a weapon born from a strategic analysis of close-order infantry combat. A Roman legionary, protected by his large scutum shield, would close with an enemy, use the shield's boss to unbalance or bash his opponent, and then deliver a short, powerful stab to the torso or groin. This motion was faster, required less room, and was far more lethal than a slash. The development and mass production of this weapon signaled a shift in tactical doctrine toward disciplined, close-range butchery, where technological superiority in blade quality and design compensated for any individual ferocity an enemy might possess. This drive for a decisive technological edge reached its most theoretical and awe-inspiring form in the mind of Archimedes during the Roman siege of Syracuse. The great mathematician and engineer, then an old man, was tasked by the city's king with turning his abstract knowledge into practical instruments of defense. Archimedes did not merely build bigger catapults. He applied fundamental principles of physics to create what seemed like supernatural weapons. Historical accounts describe his creation of massive clawed cranes that reached out from the walls, hooked onto the prows of Roman ships, and used leverage and counterweights to lift them partially out of the water before dropping them to smash on the rocks below. He allegedly designed arrays of polished bronze shields that could be angled to focus the sun's rays into a concentrated beam, setting ships ablaze at a distance. Whether entirely accurate or embellished by legend, these stories underscore a critical cognitive leap: the application of pure scientific theory, leverage, optics, mechanics to the art of war. A commander who could harness such a mind was no longer just a warrior king. He was a director of military research, understanding that the next great idea could come from a laboratory as surely as from the battlefield. Perhaps the most systematic and impactful ancient arms race occurred in China with the relentless refinement of the crossbow. This was not a single invention, but a process of continuous technological iteration driven by strategic necessity. Chinese generals faced the challenge of nomadic cavalry armies from the steppes, warriors whose mobility and archery skills were unmatched. The solution was a weapon that could be mastered with minimal training, yet possessed enough power to punch through armor at a considerable distance. The result was a series of engineering marvels: crossbows with sophisticated bronze trigger mechanisms that were precisely machined and interchangeable like modern mechanical parts. They developed repeating crossbows that could fire multiple bolts in rapid succession, creating a hail of projectiles. Most impressively, they standardized production to an incredible degree, ensuring that any bolt would fit any trigger mechanism from any armory across the realm. This was a logistical and strategic triumph as much as a technical one. It meant a commander could field a massive force of highly effective archers without years of training, and he could be certain that their equipment would function identically and be repairable anywhere. This technological advantage allowed smaller, less mobile Chinese forces to hold off much larger nomadic incursions for centuries, proving that a superior process could be as decisive as a superior warrior. The mindset required to drive this kind of innovation separates the truly great commanders from the rest. It demanded a form of strategic foresight that could peer years into the future. It involved understanding materials science to appreciate the difference that hardened steel edges could make over bronze, or biomechanics to design a shield grip that reduced fatigue. It required the organizational skill to establish and fund state-run armories and workshops, turning blacksmithing from a cottage craft into a scaled industrial operation. Most of all, it required the vision to see that the next war would not be won with the weapons of the last one. This relentless pursuit of a technological edge, this willingness to invest resources in research and development, is the most enduring legacy of ancient warfare. It established a principle that still drives global strategy today, that the future belongs not to the side with the most soldiers, but to the side that is most committed to arming them with the tools of tomorrow. Yet for all their tactical brilliance on the battlefield, the most successful ancient commanders understood that their most critical maneuvers often took place far from the front lines, in the political arenas and assembly halls back home. A general could possess the strategic mind of a genius and the courage of a lion, but without a steady flow of men, money, and material, his campaign was doomed to collapse. This created a fascinating dual challenge. These leaders had to be masters of both violence and persuasion, excelling at the art of war while simultaneously practicing the art of the deal. They were, in essence, the original startup founders, constantly pitching their vision to skeptical investors in this case, a volatile citizen assembly or a paranoid emperor, and securing the crucial funding and political cover needed to turn their ambitious plans into reality. Their survival depended on an ability to navigate the treacherous currents of domestic politics with the same skill they used to cross enemy rivers. No one embodied this principle more completely than Pericles of Athens. For decades, he maintained the Athenian Empire and its prolonged war with Sparta not solely through military might, but through the power of his oratory. The Athenian democracy was a notoriously fickle and demanding patron. Its citizen assembly, filled with rowdy farmers, merchants, and artisans, held the purse strings and could abruptly cancel a campaign, recall a general, or deny reinforcements based on a whim or a clever speech from a rival. Pericles' strategy was to master this environment through meticulous preparation and breathtaking rhetorical skill. He didn't just report on military affairs, he framed them. He transformed complex logistical needs into compelling narratives of patriotic duty and future glory. A request for funds to build more triremes became a speech about securing Athenian thalassocracy, dominance of the sea, and the wealth it brought every citizen. A need to ration grain during a siege was presented not as a hardship, but as a shared sacrifice that proved their superiority over the oligarchic Spartans. He was a master of public sentiment, using emotional intelligence to align the assembly's mood with his strategic necessities, ensuring a steady stream of resources for his military projects even when their immediate benefits were not visible. This delicate dance of managing political expectations while waging war created a unique cognitive burden for these commander-statesmen. They were forced to operate with a split strategic focus, constantly calculating a campaign on two simultaneous and interconnected levels, the military map and the political landscape. A decision on the battlefield could not be made without considering its potential echo in the forum back home. A brilliant but costly victory might be spun by political opponents as a reckless waste of lives. A cautious, economical campaign could be denounced as cowardly. This required a form of multidimensional thinking that is incredibly rare. A general like Julius Caesar was perpetually writing back to Rome, not just to report facts, but to carefully curate his image. His commentaries on the Gallic Wars are a masterpiece of this political military strategy. They were not dry military dispatches, they were thrilling adventure stories published serially to a rapt Roman audience, designed to build his popular reputation, justify his sometimes questionable actions, and maintain the support of key allies in the Senate even as he accumulated unprecedented power thousands of miles away. He understood that winning in Gaul was meaningless if he lost the narrative in Rome. The most profound challenge arose when political necessity directly contradicted military logic. This is where the truly great leaders separated themselves. A purely military mind might see a vulnerable enemy city and order an immediate assault to capitalize on the advantage. A commander who was also a politician had to ask a more complex set of questions. Would a bloody sack of this city alienate a potential ally we need for the next vote? Will the spoils from this raid be impressive enough to silence my critics in the Senate? Or should I delay to gather even greater wealth to ensure my political triumph? Is the cost in soldiers' lives worth the political capital I will gain? These were agonizing calculations. There are accounts of generals deliberately prolonging campaigns or choosing less efficient tactics because they needed a continuous stream of victories and plunder to maintain their position at home. They had to feed the political machine that fed their army, creating a cycle where military action was sometimes undertaken for its political theater value as much as its strategic outcome. This ability to balance and integrate these two competing sets of priorities to win the war while also winning the peace at home was the ultimate test of an ancient leader's strategic depth. It was a relentless game of three-dimensional chess where the most dangerous enemy was often not in front of your legions, but behind your back in the capital. Beyond the political arena and the forge of technological innovation, the truly visionary commander understood that the most decisive battlefield was often the invisible landscape of information. Long before satellites and signals intelligence, ancient generals were masters of a shadow war, building sophisticated intelligence networks whose complexity and reach would astonish many modern agencies. Their greatest weapon wasn't always a hidden dagger or a secret alliance, but a piece of timely, accurate information, a report on a harvest failure that would cripple an enemy's logistics, the precise location of a poorly guarded mountain pass, or the whispered revelation of a rival commander's deep-seated superstitions. This relentless pursuit of knowledge transformed warfare from a contest of brute strength into a high-stakes game of mental chess, where victory went to the player who could best see the board several moves ahead. The Persian Empire under rulers like Darius I created what was arguably the ancient world's most breathtaking information infrastructure. The famed Royal Road, stretching over 1,600 miles from Susa to Sardis, was far more than a trade route. It was the empire's central nervous system. Along this meticulously maintained highway, a corps of royal messengers operated a relay system of unprecedented efficiency. These riders, known as Angarium, could cover the entire distance in just 7 days, a feat that would take an ordinary traveler 3 months. Herodotus immortalized their dedication with his famous phrase, Neither snow nor rain nor heat nor gloom of night stays these couriers from the swift completion of their appointed rounds. This network allowed the Persian king of kings to receive dispatches from his satraps, send new orders, and monitor the pulse of his vast domain with a speed that effectively shrank his empire, enabling a centralized command and control that was the envy of the ancient world. It was a system designed not for the movement of armies, but for the movement of knowledge, proving that information, delivered fast enough, was itself a form of power. In China, the philosophy of intelligence was elevated to a formal art, meticulously detailed in texts like Sun Tzu's The Art of War. Chinese strategists didn't just use spies, they categorized them into a sophisticated typology, each with a specific cognitive purpose. There were local spies recruited from the enemy's own population, inward spies, officials within the enemy's administration who could be turned, converted spies, captured enemy agents who were fed false information and sent back, doomed spies, given false plans to be captured and reveal them under torture, and surviving spies, elite operatives who would return with genuine intelligence. This system revealed a profound understanding of human psychology and source reliability. A commander had to be a master analyst, constantly weighing the motivations of each source. Was the local spy reporting truth, or merely what he thought you wanted to hear to get paid? Was the converted spy truly loyal, or was he a double agent playing a deeper game? This required a deep skepticism and an ability to cross-reference reports from different types of spies to build a mosaic of the truth, a cognitive process of pattern recognition and probability assessment that is the direct ancestor of modern intelligence analysis. The cognitive demands placed on a commander by this constant flood of information, both true and false, were immense. He had to develop what modern psychologists call a theory of mind for his enemy, the ability to accurately model the thoughts, intentions, and likely reactions of his opposing general. Every piece of intelligence had to be filtered through this model. If a scout reported that the enemy was low on supplies, was this a truth to be exploited, or a carefully planted ruse designed to lure you into a rash attack? The ability to answer such questions separated legendary commanders from the merely competent. It required a form of critical thinking that could hold multiple, contradictory hypotheses in mind at once, assessing the probability of each based on a deep understanding of the enemy's past behavior, their cultural background, and their immediate strategic needs. A decision to march or to wait, to concentrate forces or to disperse them, was ultimately a high-stakes bet based on this analytical process, a gamble on which interpretation of the available information was correct. This ancient focus on intelligence represents one of the most significant cognitive leaps in the history of warfare. It marked the moment when strategy evolved from being reactive to predictive. Instead of simply responding to an enemy's movements, a general with a superior intelligence apparatus could begin to anticipate them. He could predict where an enemy would camp based on known water sources, guess their line of march by understanding their strategic objectives, and even manipulate their actions by feeding them false information through double agents. This predictive power turned the fog of war from an impenetrable barrier into a navigable, if still treacherous, mist. It allowed for campaigns of breathtaking audacity, where armies could march for weeks through hostile territory with confidence because their commander's web of spies had already mapped the dangers and neutralized the threats. The development of systematic espionage was not merely a tactical adjustment. It was the birth of a new way of thinking about conflict itself, one where knowledge was not just power, it was victory, long before the first spear was ever thrown. Yet, even with the most advanced intelligence, a commander's grand strategy was ultimately nothing more than ink on a scroll without the unwavering faith and fierce determination of the soldiers who had to execute it. This brings us to perhaps the most human and complex dimension of ancient warfare, the intricate psychology of leadership and the fragile, vital force known as morale. An army is not a machine. It is a collection of frightened, hopeful, exhausted, and courageous individuals. The ancient general's most profound challenge was not outthinking his enemy on a map, but mastering the invisible terrain of the human heart, transforming the natural fear and self-interest of thousands of men into a unified, disciplined will capable of withstanding the unimaginable horrors of close combat. They were pioneers of motivational psychology, operating without textbooks or theories, whose intuitive genius for morale management often made the difference between an army that held the line and one that shattered at the first sign of trouble. The tools they used were both brilliantly simple and deeply profound, rooted in a keen understanding of basic human needs for recognition, belonging, and purpose. Julius Caesar's legendary ability to recall the names and personal details of thousands of his centurions and key soldiers was not a parlor trick, it was a calculated leadership strategy. In a world where most men were anonymous cogs in a vast machine, being personally recognized by the commanding general was a transformative act. It signaled to a soldier that he was seen as an individual, that his specific contribution mattered to the ultimate success of the campaign. This personal connection fostered a loyalty that went beyond duty or fear of punishment. It created a powerful sense of personal obligation and a desire not to fail the commander who knew your name. Similarly, Alexander the Great's iconic act of pouring away a helmetful of precious water in the Gedrosian desert, refusing to drink while his men suffered, was a masterclass in symbolic leadership. The water itself was insignificant for an army of thousands, but the gesture was everything. It was a physical, undeniable declaration that he shared their hardships completely, that their suffering was his suffering. This act of solidarity was worth more than a dozen speeches, forging an emotional bond that compelled men to march through hell for a leader who proved he would march right beside them. Beyond these powerful personal gestures, these commanders were architects of unit cohesion, deliberately constructing a regimental identity that would supersede individual fears. They understood that a man might flee to save himself, but he would far less likely abandon the comrades standing shoulder to shoulder with him, the men he had trained, eaten, and bunked with for years. This was the genius behind the Roman legion system, where soldiers served 25-year terms. This immense duration wasn't just about gaining experience, it was about forging a new primary family. The legion became a soldier's home, his community, and the source of his identity. His loyalty was to his century, and his legion's eagle standard a potent symbol of their collective honor, more than to any abstract concept of the empire. A general nurtured this by encouraging unit rivalries in training, awarding honors and decorations to specific cohorts, and holding collective celebrations after victories. He was building what modern psychologists call in-group cohesion, making the bond between soldiers so strong that the fear of letting down their brothers became a more powerful motivator than the fear of death from the enemy. The cognitive and emotional burden on the general himself in this process was staggering. Modern neuroscience helps us understand the immense load they carried. While managing the tactical puzzle of the battlefield, a task requiring intense focus, working memory, and logical reasoning centered in the prefrontal cortex, they also had to perform a continuous emotional labor. They had to scan the mood of the troops, sensing dips in morale before they became crises. They had to regulate their own fear and project nothing but unwavering confidence, a performance that required suppressing their own natural amygdala-driven fear responses. They had to craft speeches that would resonate emotionally, tapping into the limbic system of their listeners to inspire courage or soothe panic. This is the neurological definition of multitasking under extreme stress, simultaneously engaging the brain's executive functions for strategy and its emotional centers for leadership, all while the primitive brain is screaming signals of danger. The mental fortitude required to do this effectively, day after day, is what truly separated the legendary commanders from the merely competent ones. Ultimately, this ancient art of morale management reveals a timeless truth about leadership that extends far beyond the battlefield. These generals understood that authority derived solely from rank and punishment was brittle and would fracture under extreme pressure. True, resilient authority had to be earned through demonstrated competence, shared sacrifice, and genuine empathy. They knew that to ask men to face death, you had to give them something to live for in that moment, not a distant political cause, but the respect of their commander, the pride of their unit, and the loyalty to the man next to them. This psychological foundation turned a diverse collection of individuals from across an empire into a single, formidable instrument of war. The general's mind had to be the steady hand that kept this instrument in tune, understanding that the most powerful force in any conflict is not the sharpness of the sword, but the strength of the spirit that wields it. Yet this profound understanding of morale and intelligence would count for little if a commander lacked the one mental quality that often separated fleeting triumph from lasting victory: the discipline of strategic patience. In our modern culture of instant gratification and rapid-fire decision-making, the ancient general's mastery of time itself stands as perhaps his most counterintuitive and psychologically demanding skill. This was not the passive waiting of indecision, but an active, aggressive form of temporal warfare, a conscious manipulation of the clock and the calendar to drain an enemy's strength, exploit their dwindling resources, and ultimately break their will without ever risking a catastrophic pitched battle. The greatest commanders understood that time could be a weapon sharper than any sword, if one had the cognitive fortitude to wield it. The quintessential example of this philosophy unfolded during the darkest hours of the Roman Republic. After the catastrophic defeats at Trebia, Trasimene, and Cany, the Roman army was shattered, its best generals dead, and the relentless Carthaginian general Hannibal stood at the very gates of Rome. In this atmosphere of sheer panic, the Senate made a radical choice. They appointed Quintus Fabius Maximus as dictator and gave him unprecedented power, not to achieve a glorious victory, but to simply avoid another disaster. Fabius's strategy was a masterpiece of disciplined restraint. He became the shadow that dogged Hannibal's every move through Italy. His legions would cling to the high ground, harass supply lines, and ambush foraging parties, but they would absolutely refuse the decisive battle that Hannibal so desperately sought. The Romans, used to aggressive frontal assaults, derisively nicknamed him Cunctator, the Delayer. But Fabius understood something they did not. Hannibal's army was a brilliant but fragile instrument, cut off from its home base and entirely dependent on living off the land and winning over Italian allies. By denying him a fight, Fabius was not being cowardly. He was systematically suffocating him. He was weaponizing time, allowing Hannibal's greatest weakness, his extended supply lines and political isolation, to slowly become a noose. This strategy of attrition, though infuriatingly slow and politically unpopular, saved Rome. It proved that a war could be won not by a single glorious charge, but by the quiet, relentless pressure of 1,000 uneventful days. This philosophy was being articulated with even greater theoretical depth on the other side of the world. Chinese military philosophers, particularly in the Sun Tzu tradition, didn't just see patience as a tactic. They elevated it to a fundamental principle of statecraft, intertwined with the very rhythms of the natural world. Their strategic treatises are filled with advice that seems to modern ears almost meditative. They advised commanders to be, as still as a forest, and to move like the thunderbolt, emphasizing that the overwhelming majority of a campaign should be spent in quiet, deliberate preparation, with violent action reserved only for the fleeting moment of perfect opportunity. They framed warfare within the context of the seasons, advising against spring campaigns when planting was crucial for a state's food supply, and autumn campaigns when harvests needed gathering. A wise general, they argued, would let his enemy exhaust themselves and their resources by fighting against these natural cycles, while he conserved his own strength and waited. Their concept of strategic momentum was not about brute force, but about positioning oneself in time and space so that victory became almost inevitable, requiring minimal expenditure of energy. It was the strategic equivalent of a judo master using an opponent's own weight and motion against them, rather than trying to overpower them with pure muscle. The cognitive demands of this kind of long-term thinking were, and remain, immense. Modern neuroscience helps us understand why Fabian strategies are so difficult to execute. They run directly counter to our brain's built-in reward system. The amygdala and the limbic system crave immediate resolution and the dopamine hit of a quick, decisive victory. The anxiety of a lingering threat creates a powerful psychological impulse to do something, anything, to make the uncomfortable feeling of uncertainty go away. Strategic patience, by contrast, is orchestrated by the prefrontal cortex, the brain's center for executive function, long-term planning, and impulse control. A commander like Fabius had to consciously override his own primal instincts for action, as well as the deafening political pressure from a Senate and a public terrified by Hannibal's presence on Italian soil. He had to maintain unwavering focus on a distant horizon, tolerating daily criticism and the taunts of the enemy, all while keeping his army disciplined and motivated during long periods of defensive, unglamorous work. This mental resilience, the ability to keep a complex, long-term plan active in your mind, while managing the emotional and political storms of the present, is the hallmark of the most advanced strategic minds in history. This ancient mastery of the fourth dimension time offers a crucial corrective to our modern obsession with speed and disruption. We often celebrate the move fast and break things ethos, prizing rapid iteration and immediate results. But the Fabian strategy teaches us that there are certain classes of problems that cannot be solved quickly, only outlasted. Whether facing a resilient competitor in business, a persistent social challenge, or a personal long-term goal, the principle of strategic patience reminds us that sometimes the most powerful action is a calculated, disciplined inaction. It involves having the clarity to distinguish between motion and progress, understanding that constant activity can be a form of avoidance, while steadfast, focused endurance can be the most aggressive strategy of all. The greatest ancient generals teach us that true power lies not just in knowing how to act, but in possessing the profound wisdom to know when to wait, allowing time itself to become your most trusted and unstoppable ally. To grasp the sheer magnitude of Cyrus's cognitive breakthrough, we must first understand the world he was born into. He was not the heir to a vast empire, but the ruler of Persis, a subject kingdom under the dominion of the mighty Median Empire. The Medes possessed everything a conventional military power could want: vast numbers of heavily armored cavalry, fortified cities, and the accumulated wealth of generations. A typical ambitious king might have spent decades building a similar army, hoping to eventually match the Medes spear for spear in a climactic, conventional battle, a contest he would almost certainly lose. Cyrus saw a different path. He realized that to defeat a superior power, you do not imitate it, you render its strengths irrelevant. His campaign against the Median king, Astyages, was not a war of attrition but a masterclass in applied psychology and political subversion, a campaign designed to win the allegiance of the Median Empire from within before a decisive blow was ever struck. His most ingenious maneuver was his approach to the formidable Median cavalry, the core of Astyages' military might. These armored lancers on their powerful Nicaean horses were the ancient equivalent of a tank division, seemingly unstoppable in a head-on charge. Instead of meeting this force with his own inferior cavalry or standing infantry, Cyrus re-engineered his entire army around a single, brilliant countermeasure. He equipped his Persian infantry with a new type of weapon not for killing horses, but for targeting their most sensitive attribute, their eyes. Historical accounts describe his men using long, hooked poles and specialized archers to strike at the horses' faces and eyes the moment they closed in. The effect was not mass slaughter, but mass chaos. These proud, expensively trained war horses, unaccustomed to such a focused, painful assault on their heads, would rear up in terror, throw their riders, and bolt in panic, turning the Median army's greatest asset into a source of catastrophic disarray. Cyrus didn't win by being stronger. He won by being a better behavioral psychologist, understanding that disrupting the enemy's system was far more efficient than trying to overpower it. This tactical innovation was merely the sharp end of a much deeper, more comprehensive strategy. Cyrus understood that the loyalty of Astyages' subjects was not absolute. He actively cultivated dissent within the Median ranks, sending agents to whisper promises of fair treatment and shared spoils to the Median nobility, many of whom were already discontent with Astyages' rule. He wasn't just invading a territory, he was conducting a hostile takeover of a corporate entity by winning over its key shareholders. When the final battle came, a significant portion of the Median army reportedly defected to his side, not out of fear, but because they had been convinced that Cyrus offered a better future. This victory was achieved as much through a campaign of persuasive communication as through martial prowess, proving that the most effective conquests can sometimes be peaceful. But Cyrus's truly revolutionary thinking emerged after the fighting stopped. For most conquerors of his era, victory was followed by a well-established routine: slaughter the defeated ruling family, enslave the population, loot the temples, and install a puppet governor to extract tribute through fear. This created a predictable cycle of resentment, rebellion, and costly reconquest. Cyrus looked at this ancient cycle and saw not tradition, but profound strategic stupidity. His cognitive leap was to realize that an empire held together by terror is inherently fragile and exhausting to maintain, while an empire built on consent is sustainable and can grow organically. This led to his most famous policy, enshrined in the Cyrus Cylinder: radical cultural and religious tolerance for all conquered peoples. Upon taking Babylon, he did the unthinkable. Instead of imposing his own Persian gods, he publicly honored the city's deity, Marduk, and presented himself not as a foreign oppressor, but as a legitimate ruler chosen by the local god to restore order. His most concrete act was authorizing the return of displaced populations, including the Jews, to their homelands and providing resources for them to rebuild their temples. This was not mere benevolence, it was strategic genius of the highest order. By allowing conquered peoples to maintain their cultural identity, he removed the primary fuel for rebellion. By positioning himself as their liberator and protector, he transformed subjects into stakeholders in the stability of the Persian Empire. He effectively made rebellion against him synonymous with rebellion against their own restored way of life. This was a breathtakingly sophisticated form of psychological governance, creating a cohesive empire from 100 different cultures by giving them what they wanted most: the right to be themselves. The archaeological remains of his capital, Pasargadae, provide silent but powerful testimony to this multidimensional mindset. Unlike typical royal capitals designed primarily to showcase power and intimidate visitors, Pasargadae's layout reflects a holistic vision that integrated administration, ceremony, and economics. The design incorporates influences from across his empire: Egyptian, Greek, Lydian, and Babylonian, a physical manifestation of his policy of cultural synthesis. The famous gardens were not just a pleasure ground, they were a revolutionary feat of hydraulic engineering, a display of the empire's ability to master its environment and create paradise from the arid plains, symbolizing the prosperity his rule could bring. The entire city was a monument to the idea that true power is not just taken on the battlefield, but cultivated through intelligent governance, economic integration, and a unifying vision that transcends cultural differences. Cyrus's mind was a rare instrument capable of weaving together the separate threads of military action, political narrative, economic policy, and cultural psychology into a single, durable fabric of empire, establishing a template for leadership that would inspire strategists for millennia. Now consider the sheer cognitive weight of Hannibal's decision to cross the Alps. We often picture the dramatic scene of elephants trudging through snow, but the truly staggering part happened long before, inside the general's mind. This was not a desperate flight or a wild gamble. It was a meticulously calculated strategic move, a solution to a seemingly impossible problem. His overarching goal was to bring the war directly to Rome, to break their power on their home soil. But how? The Roman navy controlled the Mediterranean, making a sea invasion a tremendous risk. A long march down the Italian coast would be a slog through defended territory, allowing Rome to muster its legions and allies at every turn. Hannibal's mind, a brilliant processor of geopolitical and topographical data, identified a third path, one so audacious the Romans would never conceive of it. The Alps were not merely a physical barrier, they were a psychological one, a wall built into the Roman strategic consciousness. By choosing to scale it, Hannibal was leveraging the terrain not for cover, but for shock, transforming a natural obstacle into the ultimate instrument of surprise. Planning phase would have been an extraordinary feat of mental modeling, a form of ancient simulation run without maps or meteorological data. Hannibal had to process a dizzying array of interdependent variables. He had intelligence likely gathered from Gallic tribes about the various passes, their gradients, the stability of their trails, the locations of potential ambush points. He had to calculate the marching rate for a vastly heterogeneous force: Numidian cavalry, Iberian infantry, and 37 war elephants, each with vastly different speeds and endurance. He was managing a colossal logistical equation in his head, forecasting the daily consumption of grain for 40,000 men and fodder for 9,000 horses and the elephants, then cross-referencing that with the dwindling opportunities for foraging as autumn turned to winter in the high mountains. Every decision was a probability assessment. What was the chance of an early snowstorm? What was the risk of a major rock slide? What was the probability that local tribes would be hostile or amenable to bribes? He was constantly weighing trade-offs, a cognitive process modern theorists call a decision matrix, balancing speed against safety and surprise against sustainability. The elephants themselves were the centerpiece of this psychological calculus. Logistically, they were a nightmare, consuming vast quantities of food and water and requiring specially reinforced pathways. But Hannibal, a master of what we now call asymmetric warfare, understood their value transcended the battlefield. Their primary weapon was terror. The Romans had never encountered them. These creatures were living siege engines, mythic monsters made real. whose very appearance could panic disciplined formations and make enemy horses bolt in fright. By undertaking the monumental effort to bring them across the Alps, Hannibal was manufacturing a legend in real time. His arrival in Italy wouldn't just be an invasion, it would be a supernatural event. The story of the impossible crossing would race ahead of his army, crippling Roman morale and awing the Italian tribes whose loyalty Rome depended on. The elephants were a weapon of perception, and the Alps were the anvil on which that perception was forged, making their logistical burden a strategic investment in demoralization. Ultimately, the successful crossing stands as one of history's greatest testaments to applied cognitive resilience. The plan, however brilliant, immediately collided with the harsh reality of avalanches, treacherous paths, and hostile ambushes. Hannibal's mind now had to shift from theorist to crisis manager, adapting in real time to catastrophic losses. He displayed what modern psychology terms cognitive flexibility, the ability to abandon aspects of the original plan without abandoning the ultimate objective. When paths collapsed, he found new ones. When morale faltered, he famously rallied his men by showing them the view of the Italian plains below, reframing their suffering as the necessary prelude to victory. He wasn't just moving an army, he was constantly rebuilding its spirit and redirecting its physical effort, all while under extreme duress. This was strategic thinking at its most dynamic, proving that the general's greatest tool was not a sword or an elephant, but a mind capable of holding a complex vision while simultaneously navigating the chaotic present. To truly appreciate the conceptual earthquake that was Sun Tzu's The Art of War, we must view it not as a simple list of battlefield tips, but as one of humanity's first attempts to create a universal operating system for strategic thought. Its power doesn't come from specific instructions for deploying chariots, but from its foundational architecture, a set of mental models and decision-making frameworks that could be adapted to virtually any high-stakes competitive environment. Sun Tzu's genius was in abstraction. He looked at the chaos of war and discerned the underlying patterns and principles that governed success and failure, then codified them into a flexible system. This was a cognitive leap on par with the scientific method, moving warfare from a realm of tradition, superstition, and brute force into a domain of analysis, psychology, and calculated efficiency. He provided generals not with a checklist, but with a new way to see the world. This systematic approach is most evident in his relentless emphasis on intelligence and knowledge as the ultimate strategic assets. His famous axiom, "If you know the enemy and know yourself, you need not fear the result of 100 battles," is more than a platitude. It's a declaration that victory is primarily an informational advantage. He broke down this knowledge into a structured analysis, advising commanders to constantly assess 5 fundamental factors: the moral law, which we might now call morale and shared purpose; heaven, meaning weather and timing; earth, encompassing terrain and logistics; the commander, representing leadership and judgment; and method and discipline, which covers organization and logistics. This framework forced a commander to think holistically, to move beyond a narrow focus on troop numbers and consider the entire ecosystem of conflict. It was a structured thinking tool designed to prevent catastrophic oversight. Perhaps his most revolutionary conceptual contribution was the principle of winning without fighting, a notion that would have seemed absurd to many war-mongering leaders of his era. Sun Tzu framed warfare not as a contest of destruction, but as a complex economic and psychological system where the highest form of skill was to achieve one's objectives at the lowest possible cost. To subdue the enemy without fighting is the acme of skill, he wrote, advocating for the strategic dismantling of an opponent's alliances, plans, and will to resist before a single sword was drawn. This reflected a profound understanding of cost-benefit analysis and systems theory. He saw a state's military not in isolation, but as an organ deeply connected to its economic health and social stability. A protracted war, even a victorious one, could drain a kingdom's treasury, devastate its population, and leave it vulnerable to other threats. Therefore, the most efficient victory was one that preserved your own resources while neutralizing the enemy's capability, a concept that resonates deeply with modern theories of competitive strategy in business and economics. The text's staggering endurance across millennia and cultures stems directly from this foundation in universal cognitive principles, not in period-specific tactics. Sun Tzu was essentially writing about how the human mind makes decisions under conditions of uncertainty, competition, and limited resources. His chapters on deception are masterclasses in theory of mind, the ability to model what your opponent believes and then manipulate that belief. His advice on terrain is about pattern recognition and spatial reasoning. His focus on adaptability and fluidity is a primer on cognitive flexibility, the mental ability to discard a failing plan and innovate a new one in real time. These are not skills exclusive to ancient battlefields. They are the core competencies of a modern CEO navigating a market shift, a diplomat diffusing an international crisis, or even an individual planning a career path. The context changes, but the underlying mental software for strategic problem solving remains constant. This wasn't just theoretical philosophy, it was a living document shaped by practical application. The discovery of ancient bamboo slip manuscripts from the Han Dynasty, containing variations of Sun Tzu's text, provides fascinating archaeological proof of this evolutionary process. These slips show edits, alternate phrasings, and additional commentary that accumulated over time. This suggests the text was not merely read and preserved, but actively used, debated, and refined by generations of military practitioners. They were essentially field-testing his concepts, adding notes from their own experiences, and adapting the principles to new challenges. This iterative development process mirrors how scientific theories are honed through experimentation and peer review. The art of war evolved through a continuous feedback loop between abstract principle and concrete reality, becoming a collaborative project in strategic thinking that stretched across centuries, its conceptual framework growing richer and more robust with each new application. Modern neuroscience offers a stunning window into the minds of these legendary figures, suggesting their brains were not just psychologically unique, but may have been biologically optimized for the extreme demands of command. We can now theorize, based on scans of modern strategic thinkers, that an exceptional ancient general's brain was a masterpiece of real-time neural computation, operating with a fierce efficiency in regions that most of us struggle to access under pressure. The heart of this activity would have been the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, the brain's central command for executive function. This is where complex variables, the projected rate of arrow expenditure, the mood of the troops, the angle of the sun for an afternoon attack, were constantly juggled and synthesized into a single, coherent plan. While a subordinate might see a chaotic battlefield, a commander like Hannibal or Thutmos III was running a sophisticated mental simulation, their prefrontal cortex working like a hyper-advanced processor to calculate probabilities and outcomes far faster than their contemporaries. This cognitive firepower was useless without an equally impressive ability to manage the body's primal stress response. The amygdala, our ancient alarm bell for threat, would have been screaming at the sight of 40,000 enemy troops, the smell of blood, and the deafening roar of combat. The general's supreme skill was in consciously regulating this panic center, suppressing the flight impulse so that Chinese letter, calculating prefrontal cortex could remain in charge. This neurological tug-of-war is physically draining, mediated by hormones like cortisol. A lesser leader would have succumbed to cognitive tunneling, a stress-induced narrowing of focus where you fixate on a single, immediate threat and miss the bigger picture. The great commanders, by contrast, exhibited what modern science calls cognitive flexibility. They could receive a report of a cavalry flank collapsing, feel the surge of fear, and yet instantly pivot to formulate a new plan, perhaps even leveraging the collapse as a bait for a trap. This wasn't just bravery, it was a biological capacity to keep their entire mental dashboard lit up under fire, accessing memory, planning, and creative centers while awash in stress chemicals that would shut down most people. Their mental toolkit was further specialized with enhanced pattern recognition, a skill vital for navigating the informational vacuum of ancient warfare. A distant plume of dust wasn't just dust. Its height, density, and movement were a data stream to be decoded, indicating the number, type, and speed of an approaching force. The arrangement of enemy campfires at night, the behavior of birds over a distant forest, the subtle tonal shift in a captured scout's voice, these were all patterns to be read. Their brains became expert at connecting disparate dots, seeing the hidden signal in the noise. This ability to construct a reliable situational awareness from fragments of information is linked to a network involving the temporal and parietal lobes, and it allowed them to build a more accurate mental map of the battlefield than any of their subordinates could conceive. Furthermore, the logistical genius of figures like Alexander or Cyrus points to an extraordinary capacity for working memory, the mental scratch pad we use to hold and manipulate information. Holding the entire inventory of a supply train in your head, from the number of spare axles to the remaining days of grain, while simultaneously planning a river crossing and calculating the political implications of moving through a neutral tribe's territory, is a staggering cognitive feat. This constant mental juggling act, essential for managing the campaign as a whole, relies heavily on the prefrontal cortex and would have required a neural architecture that was both powerful and incredibly efficient, minimizing mental fatigue during long periods of intense concentration. We can even see specialized brain development in their documented skills. Alexander the Great's reported ease in picking up languages to communicate with his multicultural army suggests an especially active and plastic left hemisphere language network. His ability to navigate vast and entirely uncharted territories, conceptualizing the spatial relationship between deserts, mountain ranges, and rivers without accurate maps, points to a highly developed hippocampus and posterior parietal cortex, the brain's internal GPS and spatial reasoning center. This neurological perspective doesn't diminish their achievements, it makes them more profound. It suggests that through a combination of innate predisposition and brutal, experience-driven training, these commanders literally rewired their own brains to meet the impossible cognitive demands of their time, becoming biological instruments of strategy as finely tuned as any weapon they carried into battle. Yet for all the cognitive brilliance we've explored, the ancient world offers equally powerful lessons in strategic failure, not from a lack of intelligence, but from the invisible traps of the human mind itself. Modern psychology gives us a precise vocabulary for these errors, cognitive biases, the systematic patterns of deviation from rational judgment that can ensnare even the most experienced commanders. The history of ancient warfare is littered with campaigns that collapsed not because of inferior numbers or weapons, but because a general's perception of reality became fatally distorted by his own mental shortcuts. The anaconda These were not mere mistakes, they were predictable breakdowns in thinking that continue to echo through boardrooms and battlefields today. The annihilation of the Roman legions at Cary stands as one of history's most devastating examples of overconfidence bias in action. By 216 BC, Hannibal had already humiliated Rome at Trebia and Lake Trasimene, yet the Roman Senate, driven by public outrage and aristocratic pride, demanded a decisive victory. They appointed two new consuls, Gaius Terentius Varro and Lucius Aemilius Paulus, and gave them an unprecedented 8 legions over 80,000 men, with orders to crush the Carthaginian once and for all. The sheer size of this force became its own psychological trap. Roman military doctrine was built on the unshakable belief that their heavy infantry, deployed in a massive, disciplined formation, could overpower any enemy through direct frontal assault. This deep-seated belief, combined with the numerical advantage, created a toxic cocktail of overconfidence. They saw what they expected to see, an outnumbered, cornered enemy. They dismissed Hannibal's seemingly risky deployment with his weaker troops in the center as a sign of desperation, not the meticulously baited hook it actually was. Their certainty in their own invincibility blinded them to the tactical nuance of the terrain and the flexibility of Hannibal's veteran troops, leading them to march directly into a double envelopment that would become the textbook definition of a perfect battle of annihilation. Just a few decades earlier, on the plain of Marathon, the mighty Persian Empire fell victim to a different but equally devastating cognitive error: confirmation bias. King Darius's expeditionary force, led by Datis and Artaphons, arrived in Attica with a firmly established set of assumptions. Greek hoplites were seen as provincial infantry, formidable in a narrow phalanx but hopelessly outclassed by the diverse imperial might of Persia, which combined expert archers, swift cavalry, and a reputation for invincibility. When the Athenian and Plataean hoplites did not cower behind their walls but instead advanced to block the Persian path to Athens, it created cognitive dissonance for the Persian commanders. The intelligence on the ground, the Greeks choosing to attack, their rapid advance, the surprising depth of their formation contradicted their core beliefs about Greek inferiority and passivity. Instead of updating their model to account for this unexpected aggression, the Persian leaders likely dismissed these actions as the foolish bravado of a doomed enemy. They interpreted the Greek advance not as a calculated tactical risk, but as a blessing that would allow them to destroy the Athenian army in the open field and then walk unopposed into the city. Their pre-existing beliefs acted as a filter, causing them to disregard warning signs and misinterpret the entire strategic situation, leading to a stunning defeat that would galvanize the Greek world. Beyond these famous battles, ancient history is replete with subtler yet equally catastrophic failures of thinking. The concept of groupthink, where the desire for harmony or conformity in a group results in an irrational decision-making outcome, doomed many a campaign. A general's war council, filled with sycophantic subordinates or nobles afraid to challenge royal authority, would often unanimously approve a disastrous plan, each member silencing their doubts because they believed everyone else agreed. The sunk cost fallacy, the tendency to continue a chosen course of action because of previously invested resources, led kings to throw good soldiers after bad, prolonging sieges long after any strategic benefit had vanished simply because they had already lost so many men and could not bear the thought of the sacrifice being for nothing. Then there was the fundamental attribution error, the tendency to overemphasize personality-based explanations for an enemy's behavior while underestimating situational factors. A commander might attribute an enemy's tactical retreat to cowardice or weakness, failing to see it as the deliberate feint it was, and would pursue recklessly into a prepared ambush. These ancient case studies are far more than historical footnotes. They are a timeless mirror reflecting the enduring vulnerabilities of the human mind under pressure. The same cognitive biases that led a Roman consul to ignore the contours of a battlefield or a Persian admiral to underestimate his opponents are alive and well in modern corporate mergers, political strategies, and military interventions. The overconfidence that fueled a doomed charge is the same spirit that drives a company to make an arrogant, market-breaking acquisition without proper due diligence. The groupthink that pervaded a royal war council is the same dynamic that can silence dissent in a tech company's boardroom, leading to the launch of a fatally flawed product. By studying these ancient failures through the lens of modern psychology, we gain a powerful diagnostic tool. We learn that strategic brilliance isn't just about what to do. It's also about cultivating the self-awareness to recognize our own mental blind spots, to question our most deeply held assumptions, and to create decision-making processes that are resilient to the very human errors that have haunted leaders since the dawn of civilization. Imagine the sheer volume of data a modern CEO manages with a smartphone, a laptop, and a team of assistants. Now picture a commander like Julius Caesar, holding that entire operational picture in his mind while galloping across Gaul. He had no satellite imagery, no real-time logistics software, no secure radio to coordinate legions separated by hundreds of miles. His world was one of profound informational scarcity, where critical decisions rested on fragments of intelligence delivered by breathless messengers days or weeks after events had transpired. This staggering constraint forced the development of a form of cognitive processing so advanced that modern neuroscience is only beginning to map its potential, a mental architecture where memory, calculation, and spatial reasoning merged into a single, seamless instrument of command. The core of this system was a living, breathing information network composed of human beings. Messengers were the general's broadband connection, but unlike digital packets of data, these men arrived exhausted, terrified, and potentially unreliable. A commander had to instantly assess the credibility of the messenger, cross-reference his report with previous intelligence, and filter out the emotional exaggeration that often accompanied tales of disaster or victory. This was continuous critical analysis under fire. Meanwhile, his staff officers functioned as biological servers, each specializing in a different data stream. The quaestor held the intricate details of the supply train, the exact number of grain sacks, the condition of the draft animals, the location of the next usable well, all committed to memory. The cornicularius, a senior administrative officer, would have the entire roster of centurions and their units memorized, along with casualty reports and reinforcement schedules. These weren't just assistants, they were walking, talking databases, their minds trained through relentless repetition to hold and retrieve vast datasets on demand, forming a distributed cognitive system with the general as the central processing unit. The mathematical burden alone is almost incomprehensible to the modern mind. Before moving an army of 40,000 men and 10,000 animals, a general had to solve a complex series of logistical equations entirely in his head or with rudimentary scratch pads. He needed to calculate the daily consumption of grain, not just for the soldiers but for the horses, mules, and oxen. He had to factor in spoilage rates, forecast the yield of foraging parties in unfamiliar territory, and adjust for variables like river crossings that would delay the march and extend the number of days until the next supply depot. This was applied mathematics of the highest order, performed under the immense stress of knowing that a miscalculation by even a small percentage could mean starvation, mutiny, and the complete annihilation of his force. This constant mental arithmetic wasn't an occasional task. It was a continuous background process running in the commander's mind during meetings, on the march, and even in the few hours allotted for sleep. To manage this flood of unstructured information, these leaders almost certainly employed advanced mnemonic techniques that transformed abstract data into vivid, memorable mental constructs. The method of loci or memory palace technique, where information is visualized within a familiar architectural space, would have been an invaluable tool. A general might mentally walk through the rooms of his childhood home, placing the number of cavalry squadrons in the atrium, the status of the grain ships in the dining room, and the disposition of enemy forces along the garden path. This practice leverages the brain's powerful visual and spatial memory systems, allowing for the storage and retrieval of information that would otherwise be overwhelming. Terrain itself became a living map. By constantly studying the land, noting distinctive rock formations, river bends, and forest boundaries, a commander could build a detailed three-dimensional mental model of the operational area, allowing him to simulate movements and predict enemy routes with startling accuracy, all without ever unrolling a cumbersome parchment scroll. This relentless cognitive workout likely forged neural pathways of exceptional efficiency. Modern functional MRI studies show that tasks requiring intense working memory and spatial navigation, exactly the skills honed by ancient commanders, strengthen the prefrontal cortex and the hippocampus. We can speculate that the brains of these exceptional leaders were not just psychologically different, but biologically optimized for this specific form of information processing. They developed an enhanced capacity for what is now called cognitive load management, the ability to filter signal from noise, prioritize critical data streams, and maintain focus on strategic objectives amidst a hurricane of tactical distractions. This mental discipline allowed them to absorb shocking news: a supply ship sunk, an allied tribe defecting, and within moments begin calculating the downstream effects and formulating a new plan, their minds recalibrating the entire campaign in real time. This wasn't just intelligence, it was a hardened, resilient, and supremely adaptable cognitive engine, built through necessity and refined in the most demanding environment imaginable. Without formal academies or structured curricula, the ancient world developed a remarkably sophisticated system for passing down the art of strategic command, a living network of knowledge transmission that turned military cognition into a cultural inheritance. This wasn't about memorizing a simple list of rules. It was a deep, immersive process of cognitive apprenticeship designed to shape entire mindsets. In the shadowed halls of Egyptian temples, far from the public eye, senior officers and pharaohs in training would gather in dedicated war rooms. Here, the walls were not adorned with religious iconography, but with intricate diagrams etched onto clay tablets or painted on papyrus scrolls. These were not just maps, they were complex tactical puzzles. One diagram might illustrate the optimal deployment of chariots across a specific type of desert terrain, factoring in sand consistency and the sun's angle. Another would break down the logistical flow of a supply column moving from the Nile Delta into the Sinai, detailing the number of water stops and the guard rotations needed. These sessions were immersive simulations, forcing young commanders to visualize movements, anticipate bottlenecks, and think through the cascading consequences of every decision long before they ever set foot on a real battlefield. This was pattern recognition training at its most fundamental, building a mental library of scenarios and solutions. Across the Mediterranean, the Greeks perfected a different but equally effective form of strategic socialization. The aristocratic symposium, often depicted as a wine-soaked party of philosophical debate, served a crucial military function. As the wine flowed and the conversations deepened, the talk would invariably turn to politics and war. Here, in this informal setting, retired generals and rising captains would dissect recent campaigns, criticize the decisions of contemporary leaders, and debate hypothetical scenarios. A seasoned strategist might draw a battle diagram in spilled wine on the table, challenging the younger men to propose a better flanking maneuver. This was where the underlying principles of command, the weighing of risk, the psychology of morale, the ethics of command, were debated and internalized. It was an oral tradition of strategic thinking, a continuous, peer-reviewed refining of military doctrine where reputations were made not just by bravery, but by the sharpness of one's tactical acumen in conversation. This environment cultivated a shared cognitive framework among the elite, ensuring that when they eventually led armies, they operated from a common set of strategic principles and understood each other's unspoken intentions on the battlefield. In China, this process of intellectual transmission was systematized with even greater rigor. Aspiring commanders were expected to study historical battles with the intensity of a grandmaster analyzing championship chess games. The chronicles of past wars were their textbooks, and each engagement was a complex problem to be deconstructed. A student would be given a historical scenario, the terrain, the weather, the composition of both forces, the political context, and then be required to explain the commander's actions and propose alternatives. Why did General A choose to attack at dawn from the west? What would have happened if he had feigned a retreat to the north? This relentless after-action analysis, conducted over centuries, built an immense cultural database of strategic cause and effect. It trained generations of leaders in counterfactual thinking, the ability to mentally simulate different outcomes based on varying decisions. This wasn't about learning what to do in one specific situation. It was about developing a flexible and adaptive cognitive toolkit that could be applied to entirely new and unforeseen challenges. The goal was to achieve a state of strategic fluency where the right move became instinctual. This vast reservoir of informal knowledge eventually demanded formalization, leading to the creation of texts that could preserve strategic wisdom beyond the lifespan of any single general. Authors like Onosander, in his 1st century CE work The General, made a conscious effort to move beyond mere descriptions of troop deployments. His focus was almost entirely on the psychology and character of the ideal commander. He wrote about the importance of composure, the ability to project confidence while managing internal doubt, and the critical need to understand the morale of both one's own troops and the enemy. This was a manual for the mind of a leader, a guide to the cognitive and emotional disciplines required for high command. Centuries later, Vegetius's epitome of military science served a different but complementary purpose. Written during the late Roman Empire, it was a practical synthesis of centuries of Roman military practice. It codified everything from the optimal depth of a ditch around a marching camp to the precise drill, commands for maneuvering legions under attack. But within these detailed instructions lay embedded cognitive principles, the value of standardization for reducing mental load in combat, the importance of relentless training to make complex maneuvers automatic, and the logistical foresight needed to sustain an army in the field. These texts became the hard drives of ancient military thought, ensuring that the hard-won cognitive advances of one generation were not lost to the amnesia of time, but could be booted up and utilized by commanders centuries later, creating an unbroken chain of strategic thought that stretched across millennia. This cognitive legacy is not trapped in history books, but lives on as a powerful operating system for modern challenges, proving that the most advanced strategic software often comes without a power cord. The boardrooms of today's Fortune 500 companies are perhaps the most unexpected places to find the ghost of Sun Tzu, yet his principles are quoted more often than most modern business theorists. Corporate strategists have realized that market competition is a form of non-violent warfare, requiring the same deep analysis, positioning, and psychological insight. When a tech giant like Apple decides not to compete on price but to create an entirely new product category with the iPhone, they are executing Sun Tzu's core mandate to win without fighting, to achieve supremacy by making their competitors' strengths irrelevant. They aren't selling devices, they are cultivating an ecosystem, much like Cyrus the Great cultivated the loyalties of diverse cultures, creating customers so invested in the brand's world that leaving it becomes unthinkable. This ancient idea of building a strategic landscape so favorable that victory becomes almost effortless is the holy grail of modern business strategy. The chaotic, fast-paced world of Silicon Valley startups and software development has inadvertently become a living laboratory for Hannibal-esque adaptive tactics. The modern doctrine of agile methodology, with its emphasis on small, cross-functional teams, rapid iteration based on real-world feedback, and a willingness to pivot entire strategies overnight, is a direct echo of the cognitive flexibility displayed on ancient battlefields. A startup founder facing a sudden shift in the market or a new disruptive technology is operating under the same pressures as a general whose flank is collapsing. The response is identical: abandon the failing plan without abandoning the ultimate vision, and improvise a new solution using the resources immediately at hand. This mindset values adaptability over rigid 5-year plans, treating a business plan not as a sacred text but as a hypothesis to be constantly tested and refined in the crucible of the market, a process of real-time evolution that would feel deeply familiar to Alexander the Great foraging his way across Asia. On a global scale, the colossal machinery of modern supply chain management is the direct intellectual descendant of Roman military logistics. The Roman genius for building fortified depots, maintaining all-weather roads for rapid deployment, and standardizing equipment across a vast empire finds its mirror image in today's just-in-time manufacturing and global distribution networks. A company like Amazon, with its sophisticated network of fulfillment centers, its algorithms predicting regional demand, and its relentless drive to reduce the time between order and delivery, is running a campaign not for territory but for market share, using data where Romans used papyrus dispatches. The core cognitive challenge is identical. How do you move immense quantities of material across vast distances with pinpoint accuracy and timing, managing 1,000 variables from weather to labor to fuel costs? The modern supply chain manager is a quartermaster for the global village, using satellites and software to solve the same fundamental problems of distribution and sustenance that once determined the fate of empires. Perhaps the most fascinating modern application is in the field of neuroscience, where researchers are using the documented decision-making of ancient commanders as a template for optimal cognitive function. By studying how leaders like Epermanondas or Scipio Africanus made high-stakes choices with limited information, scientists can model the neural pathways associated with superior pattern recognition, stress regulation, and cognitive control. This research is invaluable for training programs for everyone from emergency room surgeons and fireground commanders to astronauts and CEOs, professionals who operate in high-stakes, high-uncertainty environments. These modern elites are taught to cultivate a command mindset, learning to quiet the amygdala's panic and keep the prefrontal cortex engaged, to manage their own stress responses while simultaneously processing complex and fluid situations. They are, in essence, being trained to think like an ancient general because the human brain hasn't evolved a new version for the modern world. We are simply learning to better operate the original model that these strategic masters used so effectively. This enduring relevance is why military academies like West Point and Sandhurst still dedicate countless hours to the study of battles fought millennia ago. A cadet isn't memorizing the Battle of Cary to learn about Roman military history. They are dissecting it as a timeless case study in cognitive bias, in how overconfidence and a rigid attachment to doctrine can lead to catastrophic system failure. The fight against modern cyber warfare and counterinsurgency requires the same multifaceted thinking that Hannibal employed. A cyber attack is not so different from his Alpine crossing, an unexpected vector of approach that bypasses all traditional defenses. Counterinsurgency demands the same ethnographic intelligence and cultural understanding that allowed Cyrus to integrate conquered peoples, focusing on winning allegiance and building stable systems rather than just eliminating enemy combatants. The battlefield has expanded into the digital and the human terrain, but the cognitive frameworks for understanding and dominating that terrain were pioneered in the dust and blood of the ancient world, proving that while technology evolves at a blinding pace, the architecture of strategic genius is permanent. These physical remnants of the ancient world offer us something far more valuable than dates or names. They provide a direct window into the cognitive machinery of history's first great commanders, allowing us to see not just what they did, but how they thought. The discovery of thousands of cuneiform tablets in the royal archives of Cary, a city-state on the Euphrates, is a perfect example. These are not just lists of kings or epic poems. They are the raw data streams of an ancient intelligence apparatus. One tablet might be a detailed report from a merchant spy describing the movement of troops from a rival city, noting not just their numbers, but the quality of their bronze spearheads and the mood of their conscripted soldiers. Another is a letter from a provincial governor warning of a potential rebellion, citing evidence of unusual grain purchases that could be supplying insurgents. These documents reveal a command philosophy built on a relentless hunger for information. A king in Cary wasn't just waiting for news, he was actively managing a network of informants, cross-referencing their reports, and building a dynamic, constantly updated mental model of the political and military landscape across hundreds of miles. This was strategic thinking manifested in clay, a system designed to compress uncertainty and replace the fog of war with a calculated assessment of risk and opportunity. On the other side of the ancient world, the Roman Empire institutionalized this cognitive approach to personnel management in a breathtakingly modern way. The discovery of Roman military diplomas, small but intricate bronze documents issued to auxiliary soldiers after 25 years of service, is a testament to a bureaucratic mind operating on an imperial scale. These were not simple discharge papers, they were legally binding contracts that granted the veteran, and often his children, Roman citizenship and the legal rights that came with it. The cognitive leap here is staggering. Some central administrative office in Rome had to maintain meticulous records on every single non-citizen soldier across the entire empire for a quarter of a century, tracking their unit, their commander, their date of enlistment, and their conduct. This was a system that required forward thinking over decades, an understanding that the promise of a secure future was a more powerful tool for maintaining long-term loyalty and discipline than simple fear of punishment. It turned military service into a calculated investment for the soldier and a stable source of trained manpower for the state, demonstrating a profound grasp of human motivation and systemic planning that still resonates in modern human resources and veteran affairs. Perhaps the most silent yet eloquent testimony to ancient military cognition comes from the meticulous measurements of excavated weapons. In Chinese tombs dating to the Qin and Han dynasties, archaeologists have unearthed thousands of crossbow triggers and bronze arrowheads. When measured with precision tools, the consistency is jaw-dropping. The components are so perfectly standardized that a trigger mechanism from one crossbow could be fitted seamlessly onto a weapon from a different region, and arrowheads from any batch would fly with identical ballistics from any crossbow. This was not accidental. This level of industrial precision implies a centralized command that issued exact mathematical specifications to workshops across the kingdom, along with a system of quality control to enforce those standards. A general could therefore plan a campaign with incredible mathematical certainty. He knew the exact range and penetrating power of every bolt in his arsenal. He could calculate rates of fire and ammunition consumption down to the last decimal point. This logistical predictability freed his mind to focus on higher-order strategy, because he could trust that the tools of war would perform exactly as expected. It represents a cognitive shift from hoping for the best to engineering for a specific, predictable outcome. Even the humble remains of a military camp tell a story of ingrained cognitive patterns. The layout of a Roman marching camp, recreated night after night across Europe, was not a random collection of tents. Its precise, grid-like streets, its defensible entrances, and the designated areas for the commander's tent, the hospital, and the horse lines followed a rigid, pre-designed template. This was a pattern of thought made physical. By making camp construction a mindless, repeatable drill, the Romans effectively outsourced the cognitive load of security and organization to muscle memory and habit. This meant that after a long day's march, a legion didn't need to think about where to pitch tents or dig latrines. They simply executed a well-rehearsed ritual. This freed the commanding officer and his staff to use their mental energy for what mattered most, analyzing intelligence, planning the next day's route, and considering the enemy's possible movements. The camp itself was a cognitive tool, an external hard drive that stored vital organizational information in its very layout, ensuring that even exhausted, the army would remain secure and efficient. These material fragments, the clay tablet, the bronze diploma, the standardized arrowhead, the outline of a ditch, allow us to reconstruct a world where strategic brilliance was not a mystical gift but a tangible product of systemized thought. They show us that the great commanders of antiquity were not just warriors but master organizers, data analysts, and industrial managers. They built frameworks that amplified their cognitive reach, allowing them to project power and maintain control over distances and timeframes that should have been impossible. Their greatest invention was not a new weapon, but a new way of thinking, one that embedded calculation, standardization, and long-term planning into the very bones of their military institutions, creating a legacy of organized thought that would shape the world for millennia to come. The battlefield was merely one theater of operation for the ancient strategic mind. The true test of a commander's genius often began after the last sword was sheathed. Victory in war was fleeting without the ability to transform conquest into a stable, prosperous, and functional province. This required a profound cognitive shift from the destructive logic of combat to the creative, systematic work of construction and governance. The greatest generals understood that an empire was not won by the spear alone, but sustained by the road, the granary, the fair tax law, and the impartial court. Their military training had forged a unique form of intelligence, a relentless focus on systems, logistics, and large-scale organization that proved astonishingly adaptable to the challenges of peace. They stopped seeing the world as a map of threats and began seeing it as a network of opportunities, applying the same rigorous, analytical approach that won battles to the monumental task of building civilizations that would endure. Consider the career of Gnaeus Julius Agricola, whose tenure as governor of Britannia is a masterclass in this transition from warlord to state builder. After a series of successful military campaigns that pushed Roman control deep into what is now Scotland, Agricola didn't simply garrison his troops and demand tribute. He immediately launched an ambitious program of civic development that was essentially a military campaign against chaos and underdevelopment. His soldiers, the finest combat engineers in the ancient world, exchanged their swords for surveying tools and their siege engines for construction cranes. They paved over the muddy tracks of the Celtic tribes with the straight, durable, all-weather marvels of Roman roads, not just for rapid troop movements but to connect markets, accelerate trade, and bind the new province economically to the continent. He established fortified market towns at strategic junctions, providing security for merchants and encouraging the local population to gather under Roman protection and adopt Roman customs. He even sponsored the education of the sons of local chieftains in the Roman manner, understanding that cultural assimilation was a more permanent form of conquest than military occupation. Agricola was practicing a form of strategic inoculation, using infrastructure and opportunity to make the idea of rebellion not just dangerous, but undesirable and economically irrational for the conquered peoples. This systems-thinking approach to empire was perfected over centuries by the Persian Achaemenid dynasty, who created a governance model of breathtaking efficiency and flexibility. Cyrus the Great and his successors, particularly Darius I, faced the ultimate administrative challenge, governing an empire that stretched from the Indus River to the Aegean Sea, encompassing dozens of distinct cultures, languages, and religions. Their solution was to apply military organizational principles to civil administration. They divided the empire into 20 satrapies, each governed by a satrap, a role that was essentially a civilian general. Each satrap was responsible for maintaining order, collecting a fixed amount of tribute, and providing troops for the imperial army, much like a divisional commander is responsible for his sector of the front. To prevent any satrap from becoming too powerful, the system incorporated checks and balances straight from a military command structure. A separate military commander answered directly to the king, and a third official, the king's eye, acted as an imperial inspector general, traveling the realm to audit records and report on the satrap's performance. This separation of powers prevented regional tyranny and ensured the central authority's control, creating a stable and resilient administrative framework that allowed diverse cultures to thrive under a single imperial banner for centuries. The cognitive skills honed in war found direct application in the economic sphere. A general accustomed to feeding 40,000 men in a barren landscape had to be a master of resource identification, allocation, and forecasting. This same mindset, when turned to a province's economy, could produce revolutionary results. The pattern recognition a commander used to spot a weak point in an enemy's line could be used to identify a region's untapped economic potential. Perhaps a valley was ideal for olive cultivation, or a coastal village had a natural harbor that could be developed into a major trading port. Their experience managing the diverse talents of an army, archers, cavalry, engineers, medics informed their approach to managing a complex economy, understanding that farmers, artisans, merchants, and miners were all specialized components in a larger system of production. They implemented standardized weights, measures, and coinage to reduce transaction friction, just as they had standardized equipment to simplify army logistics. They commissioned detailed censuses, not unlike military roll calls, to understand the population's capacity for taxation and labor. This was macroeconomics born from military necessity, a data-driven approach to maximizing the productivity and stability of a region. Perhaps the most profound and lasting impact of this military cognition was on the very concept of law and justice. An army, especially a multi-ethnic mercenary force, cannot function without a clear, universally understood, and impartially applied code of conduct. A general dispensing justice in his camp had to be swift, fair, and consistent to maintain discipline and morale among soldiers from different backgrounds. This practice created a generation of leaders with a deeply ingrained respect for codified law and procedural fairness. When these men became governors, they brought this ethos with them. They often worked to harmonize local customs with Roman law or imperial decree, creating legal hybrids that were seen as more equitable and predictable than the sometimes arbitrary rule of local chieftains or kings. By providing a stable and predictable legal environment, they secured the most crucial ingredient for long-term economic growth and social stability: trust. Populations were far less likely to rebel against a central authority that protected property rights, enforced contracts, and resolved disputes without bias. In this way, the General's Campfire Tribunal evolved into the cornerstone of imperial administration, proving that the cognitive framework for command contained within it the blueprint for just and effective governance. This extraordinary variation in strategic thought didn't emerge from a vacuum. It was the direct product of deep cultural and environmental forces that shaped how entire civilizations perceived conflict, power, and the very nature of victory itself. To understand these distinct cognitive frameworks, we must look beyond the battlefield and into the philosophical traditions, geographic realities, and social structures that forged them. In ancient China, the development of what we now call the indirect approach was profoundly influenced by the philosophical currents of Taoism and later legalism. Taoist thought, with its emphasis on yielding to overcome strength, flowing around obstacles like water, and achieving maximum effect with minimal effort, provided the perfect metaphysical foundation for a style of warfare that prized cunning over collision. A Taoist general would see a head-on assault as the height of strategic bankruptcy, a wasteful expenditure of energy that revealed a poverty of imagination. Instead, the goal was to unbalance the opponent, to attack their strategy and their alliances before ever engaging their army, to win by making the battle itself unnecessary. This philosophical preference for subtlety and psychological manipulation is why Chinese military texts are filled with concepts like the subtle alignment of strategic momentum, where positioning and timing are considered far more important than raw combat power. It was a form of warfare that sought to harmonize with the underlying patterns of the world rather than attempting to dominate them through brute force, a cognitive approach that turned the general into a strategist philosopher. Half a world away, the city-states of classical Greece developed a military cognition that was almost the exact opposite in its underlying principles, yet equally brilliant in its execution. The famous hoplite phalanx was not merely a tactical formation. It was the physical manifestation of a specific social and political worldview. Greek warfare, particularly in its early form, reflected the values of the polis, the city-state where citizenship was inextricably linked to the responsibility of defense. The phalanx was a weapon of the citizen farmer, a densely packed formation of heavily armored infantry where each man's safety depended entirely on the discipline and courage of the man to his right and his left. This created a powerful cognitive focus on the collective, on unit cohesion, and on unwavering discipline in the face of terror. The strategic thought that emerged from this system was less about elaborate deception and more about the application of concentrated, overwhelming force at a decisive point. It was a cognitive model built on trust in one's neighbors and the absolute reliability of a drilled, standardized response. The genius of a Greek general like Epermanondas at Leuctra wasn't in tricking the Spartans, but in brilliantly modifying the phalanx, deepening one wing, refusing the other, to out-engineer them within the established paradigm of heavy infantry combat. It was a form of strategic innovation that worked within a framework of collective action and frontal decisiveness. a direct reflection of the Greek ideal of a citizenry standing together as an unbreakable wall. Meanwhile, on the vast, open steppes of Central Asia, an entirely different cognitive system was being perfected by nomadic cultures like the Scythians and later the Parthians and Huns. Their environment was their academy, and it taught a single, ruthless lesson: mobility is life. Without cities to defend or fixed fields to tend, their entire society was built around movement, the herding of animals, and the ability to traverse immense distances. This lifestyle forged a military mind that saw the battlefield not as a confined space to be dominated, but as an infinite canvas to be exploited. Their strategic cognition was spatial and temporal to a degree that sedentary civilizations struggled to comprehend. They possessed incredibly detailed mental maps of thousands of square miles of territory, knowing every source of water, every passable canyon, every patch of grazing land. Their warfare was a masterpiece of strategic deception and harassment. They would feign retreat to draw slower, heavier armies deep into barren territory, stretching supply lines to the breaking point before wheeling around to annihilate the exhausted and isolated invaders. The famous Parthian shot firing arrows backwards from a galloping horse wasn't just a trick, it was the symbol of an entire philosophy of war. It represented the ability to exert lethal force while constantly controlling the distance and terms of engagement, a form of combat that emphasized constant motion, pinpoint accuracy, and the psychological torment of an enemy who could never close for a decisive fight. Their cognitive edge was their deep, intuitive partnership with the landscape, turning the emptiness of the steppe into their most powerful weapon. When these divergent cognitive systems finally collided, the results were often catastrophic for the side that failed to adapt. The most stunning example is the Battle of Cary in 53 BCE, where the Roman general Marcus Licinius Crassus, embodying the ultimate expression of disciplined, heavy infantry supremacy, met the Parthian horse archers and cataphracts of General Shauna. The Romans, masters of close-quarters combat and fixed-line battle, were cognitively unprepared for an enemy who refused to stand and fight. The Parthians employed their classic steppe nomad strategy, surrounding the Roman square with swirling clouds of horse archers whose composite bows outranged Roman javelins. They would advance, unleash a devastating hail of arrows, and retreat before the Romans could respond, all the while staying just out of reach. When the Romans tried to advance, the Parthians would withdraw, maintaining the lethal distance. When the Romans formed a defensive testudo or tortoise formation, the Parthians simply waited, allowing the desert sun and the psychological pressure to do their work. The heavy Roman armor, ideal for a pushing match between phalanxes, became an oven in the Mesopotamian heat. The legionaries, trained for decisive, face-to-face combat, were systematically dismantled by an enemy they could not touch. Crassus, a product of a system that valued steadfastness and direct pressure, was utterly outthought by a commander operating from a completely different cognitive playbook. It was a clash not just of armies but of incompatible strategic universes, and it demonstrated with terrible finality that no single way of thinking could claim supremacy. The most successful empires, like Rome eventually learned, were those that could cognitively adapt, incorporating new ideas, whether it was recruiting foreign cavalry or studying the tactics of their enemies, into their own strategic framework, creating a more resilient and multifaceted military mind. Beneath the polished bronze armor and the public facade of invincibility, every ancient general inhabited a private world of almost unbearable psychological pressure. We often picture these legendary figures as stoic and unflappable, but historical sources pull back the curtain to reveal men grappling with profound fear, doubt, and the crushing weight of absolute responsibility. Unlike a modern CEO or general who can rely on teams of advisors, real-time data, and secure communications, an ancient commander stood utterly alone. His decisions were made in an informational vacuum. His orders took days to reach distant units, and the consequences of a single miscalculation were not a dip in stock price but the annihilation of thousands of men and the downfall of his entire civilization. This was a level of stress that is almost unimaginable today, a constant companion that shadowed every move from the planning tent to the front lines. One of the most pervasive and unique psychological burdens was the mantle of divine responsibility. A pharaoh of Egypt was not just a political leader, he was the living embodiment of the god Horus, the crucial intermediary between the people and the gods. A defeat in battle wasn't merely a strategic setback, it was a theological crisis, a sign that the gods had withdrawn their favor, potentially plunging the entire kingdom into chaos. Roman generals spent hours consulting augurs, examining the entrails of sacrificed animals for signs of divine will before committing to a battle plan. This wasn't simple superstition, it was a form of extreme accountability. The fate of the state, its people, and its cosmic order rested directly on their shoulders. A bad harvest, an unexpected storm, or a lost battle could all be interpreted as a personal failure in their sacred duty. This constant need to balance military practicality with spiritual anxiety added a layer of existential dread to the already immense burden of command. Even the most celebrated commanders were not immune to the physical and emotional symptoms of this immense stress. Plutarch and other historians describe Alexander the Great suffering from vivid nightmares and bouts of intense anxiety before major engagements. The man who appeared invincible to his troops would retreat to his tent, wrestling with doubt and the specter of potential failure. We see similar accounts of Roman consuls like Scipio Africanus, who was known to withdraw for periods of solitary prayer and contemplation before key moments, seeking not just divine favor but also personal clarity and resolve. These weren't signs of weakness, they were the natural human reactions to an inhuman level of pressure. Their bodies and minds were reacting just as a modern person's would before a life-altering event, but for them, these events were a constant feature of their lives, with no vacation or therapist to provide relief. Their coping mechanisms were the ancient world's equivalent of mental armor, developed through necessity and often deeply philosophical. Many Greek and Roman commanders turned to Stoicism, a philosophy that taught the separation between what one can control and what one cannot. This wasn't about suppressing emotion, but about managing it through rational discipline. A Stoic general would pour his energy into the things within his control: the training of his men, the fortification of his camp, the precision of his logistics. He would consciously accept that the weather, the actions of the enemy, and the fortunes of battle were beyond his direct command, thereby reducing the anxiety associated with unpredictable outcomes. This mental framework allowed them to make clear-headed decisions amidst chaos, not because they felt no fear, but because they had trained their minds to not be ruled by it. Similarly, the meticulous performance of religious rituals before battle served a crucial psychological purpose. These prescribed ceremonies provided a sense of order and control in a situation defined by chaos. By following the correct steps and receiving favorable omens, a general could bolster his own confidence and that of his troops, transforming collective anxiety into focused resolve. This ancient understanding of the mind under pressure reveals a sophisticated, if pre-scientific, grasp of emotional regulation that closely parallels modern therapeutic techniques. When a general practiced stoic reflection, analyzing his fears to separate rational concern from irrational panic, he was engaging in a process strikingly similar to cognitive behavioral therapy, which identifies and challenges distorted thought patterns. His deliberate use of ritual to calm his mind and center his focus is a direct ancestor of modern mindfulness and meditation practices used by special forces soldiers and elite athletes today to achieve a state of flow and peak performance under pressure. Their ability to project unwavering confidence to their troops while privately managing their own terror demonstrates a masterful level of emotional intelligence, the capacity to recognize, understand, and manage not only their own emotions but also the collective mood of thousands of others. They were, in effect, the psychologists for their entire army, responsible for maintaining morale, mitigating panic, and inspiring courage, all while doing the same for themselves. This inner psychological dimension completes our picture of ancient strategic genius, revealing that the mind that could outmaneuver an enemy on the field was first a mind that had learned to outmaneuver its own deepest fears in the quiet solitude of command. Their strategic minds represent some of the most sophisticated cognitive achievements in human history, a testament to what the unaided human intellect can accomplish under the most extreme pressures imaginable. These commanders developed intricate patterns of thinking that continue to echo through modern military academies, corporate boardrooms, and leadership seminars thousands of years later. Their true genius wasn't merely in winning battles but in creating entire frameworks for processing chaos. Frameworks so robust they remain startlingly relevant in our era of digital networks and global crises. What makes their cognitive feats so extraordinary is that they achieved this without any of the technological crutches we take for granted: no satellite imagery, no real-time communication, no supercomputers to run simulations. They were living, breathing supercomputers, forced to hold entire campaigns in their minds, calculating supply lines and enemy intentions through sheer mental horsepower while surrounded by the screams of battle and the fog of war. This ancient form of cognitive excellence offers us timeless lessons, not in how to fight wars but in how to think. Their mastery of systems thinking, seeing an army not as a collection of individuals but as a single, complex organism with needs for food, water, morale, and movement, is directly applicable to managing any large organization today. A modern CEO overseeing a global supply chain faces the same fundamental challenge as Alexander the Great marching across Persia: how to keep a vast, distributed system functioning smoothly despite unpredictable disruptions. The ancient generals' relentless focus on pattern recognition, reading meaning into distant dust clouds, interpreting the significance of altered campfire routines, predicting enemy movements based on cultural knowledge, is the direct ancestor of modern data analytics. They were human algorithms, constantly filtering noise to find signal, a skill desperately needed in our world of information overload where the crucial data point is often buried in an avalanche of digital chatter. Perhaps their most vital lesson for our complex modern world is their profound comfort with adaptive response. These leaders understood that no plan, no matter how brilliant, survives first contact with reality. Their cognitive flexibility, the ability to watch a meticulously crafted strategy unravel and instantly innovate a new solution, is the exact same mental muscle required to navigate today's rapidly shifting landscapes, from sudden market disruptions to emerging global pandemics. The Roman general who pivoted from a failed frontal assault to a surprise naval landing is employing the same cognitive playbook as a tech company abruptly shifting its business model in response to a new competitor, or a global health organization recalibrating its response to a mutating virus. The core challenge is identical: overcoming cognitive inertia, letting go of a failing course of action, and mobilizing an entire system toward a new objective with speed and conviction. The ultimate legacy of these strategic pioneers isn't carved into stone monuments or recorded in the lists of conquered territories. Their true monument is the very architecture of human thought they helped to engineer. They demonstrated the astonishing heights of cognitive potential that humans can reach when forced to focus on multidimensional problems solving under life or death constraints. They proved that strategic thinking is ultimately a human technology, one that transcends the tools of any era. Whether wielding a bronze sword or a digital dashboard, the fundamental challenge remains how we process information, manage paralyzing uncertainty, and make decisions that create a better future from a chaotic present. Their minds, honed in the dust of ancient battlefields, continue to light the way, reminding us that the most powerful weapon in any era is not the technology we hold in our hands, but the quality of the thinking we hold in our heads. If this exploration of history's most formidable military minds has sparked your curiosity, we would love to hear which strategist's approach resonated most deeply with you. Was it Cyrus the Great's masterful understanding of cultural psychology and governance, or perhaps Hannibal's breathtaking cognitive flexibility in the face of the Alps? Share your thoughts in the comments below. These discussions breathe new life into ancient wisdom and allow us all to see these legendary figures from fresh perspectives. For more journeys into the way humans have solved complex problems throughout history, be sure to subscribe to our channel. Tapping that notification bell ensures you won't miss our next deep dive, where we'll continue to unpack how these age-old thinking patterns still influence modern leadership, innovation, and strategy in our own complex world. Your participation doesn't just fuel more content, it helps keep these incredible intellectual traditions alive and relevant for everyone who believes that the past still has profound lessons to teach us.